Step right into Georgian Britain, a world where wigs were skyscrapers, waistcoats were tighter than anyone's circulation could reasonably withstand, and social life operated with the intensity of a competitive sport. The era spans from 1714 to 1830, a glorious stretch of time when aristocrats, wannabe aristocrats, and people pretending not to be broke created a party culture so extravagant, so chaotic, and so wildly self-destructive that even the Victorians, the champions of judging everyone, whispered, "My goodness, oh, they did what?" This is the era where entertainment didn't just accompany life, it was life. Everything was either a party, preparation for a party, recovery from a party, or gossip about the party you weren't invited to. The enthusiasm for revelry was so high that if you had told a Georgian aristocrat that one day human beings would willingly stay home to watch something called television, they would have concluded society had collapsed and civilization was doomed. The good news? You're invited. The bad news? This invitation may ruin your dignity, your reputation, and your liver. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand why Georgian parties were such a spectacle, you first need to understand the personality of the age. Unlike the stiff upper lip Victorians who came after, the Georgians were more like, yes, morals are important, but have you tried ignoring them temporarily and seeing what happens? It's a period powered by impulsive decisions, powdered faces, and the belief that more is always better. More candles, more food, more music, more flirtation, more dancing, and perhaps most crucially, more drama. Social life was the bloodstream of Georgian society. Being seen mattered, being noticed mattered, being talked about, even for unflattering reasons, mattered. If the Victorian ideal was dignity, the Georgian ideal was performance. There was always someone watching, evaluating, whispering behind their fan, or writing a letter that would circulate through 10 households before breakfast. So naturally, people put on a show, and these weren't everyday small gatherings either. Oh no. A Georgian party was a full-scale theatrical production, complete with costumes, lighting issues, unpredictable characters, emotional plot twists, and the occasional structural collapse of a ballroom floor. Guests didn't just attend parties, they survived them. Successfully navigating a social event was like navigating a minefield, while wearing shoes with absolutely no traction. The energy of Georgian society was fueled by massive developments, urban growth, new wealth, booming trade, and an ever-expanding middle class that desperately wanted to prove it belonged among old money. That meant more people hosting events, more competition between households, and more elaborate displays meant to convince the world that, no, I'm not financially panicking, this 400-candle chandelier is supposed to be here. And of course, Wimbledon wishes it could match the competitive spirit of these gatherings. Everything, and I mean everything, was a social contest. Who had the best musicians? Who poured the strongest punch? Whose footman fainted first from overwork? Who managed to attend 5 separate parties in one night without losing consciousness? Georgian Britain invented the concept of social climbing, and then immediately turned it into a blood sport. But beneath the glitter, there was always a touch of danger. Don't let the silk dresses and powdered wigs fool you. Georgian parties were risky business. Candles tipped over, people tripped over their own clothing, servants collapsed, drunken duels started behind potted plants. Guests occasionally mistook someone else's lap for a chair, and if none of that happened, someone's wig probably caught fire. It didn't help that many parties were packed into townhouses that were never really meant to hold 200 people, 3 violins, and one mysteriously imported monkey wearing a tiny hat. But the Georgian motto was, essentially, if it fits, it parties. Even the way people entered these events had flair. This was a world obsessed with displays, dramatic entrances down grand staircases, carefully orchestrated greetings, fans snapping open in perfect choreography. If someone fell down the stairs, even better. That just ensured you were the star of the night. Georgian social life was powered by spectacle, and nothing made a better story than chaos. But why did all of this matter so much? Why the urgency? Why the constant noise, glitter, and emotional whiplash? Because this was an era in transition, politically, socially, culturally. Old and new ideas coexisted in uneasy harmony. Wealthy families competed with newly rich merchants. Traditional morality clashed with rising hedonism. Parties became the arena where all of these tensions played out. Think of them as the Georgian version of social media. Common sense wasn't required, but dramatic impact definitely was. And the danger wasn't just physical, but reputational. Each event offered opportunities for alliances, flirtations, rumours, or total personal destruction. One wrong move and you weren't just embarrassed. You were immortalised in satire prints across London by a caricaturist who lived for your disaster. Georgian parties were more than entertainment. They were explosive cultural pressure valves. They weren't meant to be they weren't meant to be quiet. They weren't meant to be dignified. They were meant to be seen, felt, survived, and most importantly, talked about for days afterward. So welcome to the Georgian party machine, a place where elegance met chaos, refinement met recklessness, and society collectively decided that the best way to decorate an evening was with unpredictability. Now, take a deep breath, powder your wig, straighten your stockings, and mentally prepare yourself, because we are just getting started. If the last part introduced you to the wild electricity of Georgian social life, then this is where you discover why everyone, from aristocrats with ancestral titles to wealthy merchants still smelling faintly of warehouse receipts, suddenly decided that hosting parties was the ultimate life purpose. In Georgian Britain, throwing a party wasn't just an evening activity, it was a weapon. A status display, a political strategy, a matchmaking arena, a reputation-building exercise, and occasionally a carefully disguised cry for help from someone who definitely overspent on imported pineapples. To understand why Georgians became hosting fanatics, picture a society obsessed with hierarchy, but also deeply insecure about its place within it. For centuries, aristocratic bloodlines were the gold standard of status. If your ancestors had held a title, or a castle, or at minimum an unreasonably large portrait of themselves glaring disapprovingly, you were in. But by the 18th century, new wealth was crashing the gates. Merchants, bankers, East India Company investors, and people who'd made suspiciously large fortunes selling things like tea or sugar suddenly wanted in on the fun. And so the party scene became the battlefield where all these competing groups tried to win the same war. The war of social legitimacy. Hosting was the fastest, most dramatic way of announcing, I belong here, don't question me, admire my chandelier. Parties were public currency. Everyone could see who attended, how luxurious the setting was, how impressive the food looked, and how many people left still conscious. And when your entire standing in society depended on the opinions of other people wearing powdered wigs, you went big, very big. In Georgian Britain, politics didn't just happen in Parliament, it happened in drawing rooms, supper tables, and candlelit salons where powerful guests lingered over wine. Hosting was a strategic move. If you invited the right people, impressed them with enough wealth and subtle flattery, and kept the conversation spirited, but not so spirited that anyone challenged the king's sanity, you could build alliances that lasted decades. Members of Parliament courted support through receptions, aristocrats forged networks over the tea tables, and ambitious social climbers tried to charm their way up the hierarchy by seating important guests in the best-lit corners of the room. If a political opponent was denied an invitation, that wasn't an oversight. It was a declaration of social war. Being left off a guest list could cause genuine outrage. People kept invitation lists the way modern politicians track polling numbers. And yes, some hosts absolutely kept score. If you think modern status competition is intense, Georgian parties operated with the emotional subtlety of medieval jousting. These events were designed to humiliate rivals, showcase superiority, and remind everyone exactly where they stood. Hosting became a performance of dominance. Bigger rooms meant bigger influence. Better musicians meant better taste. More guests meant more prestige. And a dessert table featuring fruit from halfway across the world meant you had money to burn and no concept of financial restraint. Every guest who stepped into your home was an audience member in the ongoing play titled Look Upon My Wealth and Despair or Pretend Not to, depending on your upbringing. The social weapons were quiet but deadly. A poorly lit staircase for the rival heiress, a deliberately awkward seating arrangement to force two feuding nobles together, a pointed comment about simple decor at someone else's event. These weren't accidents. The Georgian era perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare long before social media gave us new ways to do it. Now, let's talk romance, or more accurately, the thrilling emotional roller coaster Georgians insisted on calling courtship. Parties were the primary arena for romantic plotting. If you wanted to find a spouse, flirt, secure a marriage alliance, or discreetly tempt scandal, the party scene was the place to do it. In a society where public behaviour was heavily monitored, but private emotion was bubbling beneath several layers of silk and self-restraint, parties were the loophole in the system. A carefully timed dance, a whispered conversation near a window, a strategically dropped handkerchief. This was how relationships began, evolved, or exploded. And because love and economics were inseparable, parents hosted with the intensity of Olympic coaches pushing for gold medals. A successful match wasn't just emotional triumph, it was financial strategy. Hosting became an investment in a family's future, especially if that future involved marrying into a title that had fallen on hard times but still looked excellent on paper. At the heart of it all was something deliciously human, the desire to brag. Georgians adored being envied. Hosting a successful party meant your name circulated through town the next day, wrapped in admiration, intrigue, and, if you were lucky, only mild scandal. Hosts competed over everything. Who had the most wax candles burning simultaneously? Who built the most fashionable new reception room just for social events? Who hired the violinist everyone whispered about? Who offered the most extravagant supper, complete with jellies that wobbled like political stability? Bragging rights were so powerful that some families risked bankruptcy just to stay socially relevant. There are recorded cases of hosts selling entire estates to finance a season of entertaining. Because what was financial ruin compared to the delicious thrill of hearing someone say, "Did you see their ballroom? Astonishing." This chapter ends where it must, acknowledging that Georgian parties weren't innocent gatherings, they were reputational battlegrounds. Every candle flame, every menu, every arrival time, every compliment or lack thereof was part of a complex social dance meant to elevate some and devastate others. A successful party could catapult a family upward. A disastrous one could end a season, a courtship, or an entire political future. So yes, everyone was obsessed with hosting. Not because they loved fun, though many did, but because in Georgian Britain, a party wasn't just an event. It was your resume, your brand, your billboard, your battlefield, and your best chance at rewriting your social fate. Before anyone stepped into a Georgian party and risked their reputation, their balance, or their wig, they first had to win the most critical contest of all, getting invited. Because unlike modern parties, where invitations often involve messages like "pull up whenever," Georgian invitations were weapons of power, diplomacy, and occasionally pure, unfiltered pettiness. In Georgian Britain, an invitation wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a social verdict. Receiving one meant you matter. Not receiving one meant we have collectively decided you do not exist. And pretending not to receive one, well, that was an art form all on its own. Welcome to the invitation game, a labyrinth of codes, tricks, etiquette traps, and strategic sabotage where your future could be determined not by your behaviour at a party, but by the very fact that the card arrived at your door. Before you could even hope to receive a party invitation, you needed a proper introduction into the society's network, and that meant calling cards. Calling cards were small, elegant rectangles of cardstock embossed with your name, or in some cases, your name plus 3 unnecessary titles. These cards functioned like a Georgian LinkedIn profile. Your entire social worth shrunk down to an inch of decorative paper. When you left a calling card at someone's home, it was a declaration of interest, a request, a plea, a lightly veiled announcement that said, "Please acknowledge my existence." But not all calling cards were created equal. The expensive ones practically whispered, "This card costs more than your monthly rent." The cheap ones said, "I tried." A bent corner, a certain way of folding it, or even the time of day it was delivered communicated subtle meaning. "I visited personally," "I'm mildly offended," or "I want something from you but will pretend I don't." A pile of calling cards stacked in your entryway was the sign of someone socially desirable. No pile meant you were essentially a polite ghost floating through London society. If calling cards were the opening moves, engraved invitations were the prize. These weren't cheap ink-on-paper affairs. No, Georgians wanted their invitations to make a dramatic entrance, often with heavy cardstock, gold leaf borders, intricate printing, and sometimes handwriting so aggressively fancy you could barely decipher it. An engraved invitation was proof that your host didn't just invite you, they invested in inviting you. When an invitation arrived, it usually came through a servant, because nothing communicated urgency like someone banging loudly on your door to deliver a small rectangle of card. Guests opened them with breathless anticipation, hoping for a grand ball, a dinner party, a musicale, or, if their luck was terrible, an invitation to a gathering hosted by someone with more ambition than skill. Of course, the moment you opened the invitation, you had to respond exactly correctly. Too fast, desperate, too slow, disrespectful, not at all. Social suicide. Georgian etiquette manuals loved to remind readers that a delayed reply makes the host uneasy, which was the 18th century version of "they left me on read." There were respectable strategies for earning invitations, though respectable may be doing some heavy lifting here. Be useful. A person with musical talent, an impressive title, or amusing gossip was more valuable at a party. Hosts loved guests who could fill silence with charm or scandal. Be attractive. Beauty got invites. Handsome men and lovely women added aesthetic value to the room. Yes, aesthetic value was absolutely a calculation. Be wealthy. If you owned a townhouse large enough to house wildlife, you were guaranteed to be added to everyone's list. Know people who know people. Social circles were tight. Gaining one good connection could catapult you into dozens of households. Be mysterious. Nothing intrigued Georgians more than someone with a dramatic story. Did you travel abroad? Were you rumoured to have a questionable past? Did your distant cousin elope with a dancing instructor? Perfect, you're invited. Because some parties weren't desirable at all. Some were boring, some were dangerous, some were disastrously organised by people who believed powdered wigs could hide structural chaos. To escape an unwanted invitation, Georgians deployed creative excuses. Sudden illness, the universal favourite. A fabricated prior engagement. A trip planned at suspiciously short notice. Indisposition, a vague word meaning absolutely anything you wanted it to. If all else failed, the most elegant solution was simply to pretend you never received it. Invitation? My dear, it must have been lost in transit. The host knew you were lying. You knew the host knew. Everyone played along. It was polite warfare. Now we reach the fun part. The sabotage. Invitations could be manipulated to send brilliantly vicious messages, inviting someone at the last minute so they arrived unsure if they were meant to be there. Sending an invitation to someone known for poor dancing just to watch chaos unfold later. Inviting rivals to intentionally seat them near one another. A favourite of especially theatrical hosts. Deliberately forgetting to send an invitation to someone who expected one. The Georgian equivalent of emotionally slapping them with a glove, but the cruelest tactic? inviting a socially awkward acquaintance purely for entertainment value. There are accounts of guests being invited specifically because watching them mingle was considered the evening's main attraction. Georgian society was not kind. Ultimately, the invitation game wasn't about the parties themselves, it was about who mattered. Every envelope carried a verdict. Every acceptance or decline carried meaning. Invitations granted social life its structure, a hierarchy based not on merit, but on perception, proximity, and pure theatrical flair. To be invited was to be seen. To be excluded was to be erased. To pretend you weren't invited, that was survival. And this is why the Georgian world treated invitations like sacred objects or loaded weapons. If you were invited to a Georgian party, you weren't just stepping into a home, you were stepping into a carefully engineered performance venue designed to make you gasp, envy, and possibly question your own financial choices. A Georgian house wasn't simply a building. It was a personality test, a competitive sport, and a brag sheet in architectural form. The moment a guest crossed the threshold, the house itself began whispering, "Admire me. Praise me. Fear the amount of money spent on me." In the Georgian era, interiors weren't private spaces meant to comfort residents. They were theatres of ambition. Entire renovations were done not because the family needed more space, but because they needed more gasps from visitors. Staircases weren't built for practicality. They were built to stage grand, slow-motion entrances that showed off clothing, wealth, and the fact that gravity had not yet claimed your wig. The simple act of descending from one floor to another became a calculated moment of social drama, the Georgian equivalent of stepping onto a red carpet while hoping your shoe buckle didn't betray you. Everything about the typical upper-class Georgian home was exaggerated for effect. Reception halls were often larger than the kitchens because priorities were very clear. Feeding guests mattered far less than impressing them. Hallways were long and intentionally echoing, so your arrival felt important even if you absolutely were not. And the decor? Imagine a world where interior designers collectively agreed that subtlety was a crime. Walls were adorned with ornate mouldings, elaborate plasterwork, and patterns so detailed that staring at them too long felt like taking an eye exam. Lighting played a major role in this theatrical universe. Before electricity, people relied on candles, thousands of them, sometimes tens of thousands in grander houses, to illuminate their spaces. Candles weren't just for visibility, they were symbols. The more candles you burned, the more impressive you appeared, and the more your guests knew you were happily setting your money on fire for their entertainment. And candles meant chandeliers, massive, glittering, shimmering chandeliers that reflected light onto polished surfaces. They dangled dangerously above people's heads, swaying slightly as if reminding everyone that fire safety was still centuries away from being invented. Their purpose was clear: make everyone look beautiful, make the room sparkle, and if someone's wig smoked a little, well, that was a small price to pay. And those polished surfaces, mirrors, everywhere. Georgian hosts adored mirrors the way modern influencers adore ring lights. Mirrors expanded rooms, multiplied the candlelight, and made the entire house feel larger, richer, and infinitely more flattering. Guests could admire themselves from every angle, and Georgians absolutely did. Some homes even installed mirrors across from entrances so visitors could walk in, see their reflection, and immediately feel more glamorous. Mirrors served the double function of flattering guests and boasting, "Look how many reflective surfaces we can afford." If someone walked in and didn't gasp, the mirror arrangement needed rethinking. The emphasis on spectacle extended to decor choices. Gold leaf was the era's favourite decorating tool. If something stood still long enough, a Georgian homeowner would put gold on it. Banisters, ceilings, picture frames, columns, doorways, and sometimes even furniture legs ended up shimmering with decorative gilding. The philosophy was simple. Why have wood when you can pretend it's gold? Why have simplicity when you can blind guests with opulence? The good news was that everything sparkled. The bad news was that subtlety was carried out of the house and buried somewhere deep underground. Even the layout of rooms was strategically designed. Drawing rooms, parlours, ballrooms and long galleries were composed like social mazes. A host could lead guests from one stunning room to another, each more lavish than the last, like a real-life sequence of architectural jump scares. The goal was to overwhelm the senses, to create a journey of aesthetic escalation. By the time guests reached the ballroom, they were already softened up by visual overstimulation and likely much more receptive to thinking their hosts were impressive geniuses. And we cannot forget the gardens. While not technically inside the house, they were part of the same showmanship. Manicured hedges, stone pathways, and symmetrical designs added to the sense that everything on the property existed purely to be admired. Guests strolling outside could gaze upon fountains, statues, and trees trimmed with such precision that even nature itself seemed forced to adhere to Georgian aesthetic rules. The house and its grounds together formed a single message. This is not a home, this is a lifestyle announcement. All of this architectural drama created a powerful effect. Entering a Georgian house made guests instantly feel like participants in a glamour-filled ritual. The environment controlled mood, behaviour, and even posture. People straightened their spines, adjusted their wigs, and softened their expressions as though the walls themselves were judging them. And, to be fair, in Georgian Britain, they probably were. By the time guests reached the main event room, they were fully primed for whatever chaos the evening held. The house had done its job. It had dazzled, manipulated, and theatrically prepared everyone for the real spectacle to come. In a society where appearances meant everything, the house itself became the opening act. Before you can understand the chaos of a Georgian party, you must first understand the chaos of getting dressed for one. Clothing in the 18th century wasn't merely fashion. It was a hazardous architectural challenge wrapped in silk and tied together with questionable engineering. Wearing Georgian party attire was less like putting on clothes, and more like stepping into a structural experiment that could either make you look stunning or collapse dramatically in front of 50 witnesses. You weren't dressed to impress, you were dressed to test gravity. Let's start with the foundation, and yes, it needs that word because Georgian clothing truly was built in layers. For women, the first ordeal was the corset. Now Georgian corsets weren't the Victorian lung crushers of later decades, but they were still firm, rigid, and determined to position your torso in ways nature had never intended. Their purpose wasn't just shaping, it was posture correction, bust elevation, and, ideally, preventing you from bending at any angle that suggested you were a mortal human being with a spine. Women didn't sit, they perched. They didn't bend, they folded politely at the hips like decorative dolls. Once the corset was secured, usually by someone else because self-lacing was a fantasy, it was time for the hoops, glorious, enormous hoops. These weren't modest skirts with a little structure. These were skirt frameworks with the wingspan of a medium-sized barn door. Depending on the decade, some were round while others created the spectacular pannier shape that stretched outward from the hips so widely that passing through a doorway became an Olympic-level challenge. Women learned to turn sideways, glide carefully, and hope they didn't take out a candlestick or an unsuspecting servant along the way. The hoops created the wide silhouette Georgians adored, but they also created logistical nightmares. Sitting required technique. Entering a carriage required divine intervention. Dancing required spatial awareness that surely counted as a spiritual discipline. One wrong turn and you could knock over 3 guests, a punch bowl and a decorative plant in a single sweep, all in the name of beauty. And then came the wigs. Georgian wigs weren't small fashion statements. They were vertical monuments, architectural marvels, social status hyperbole sculpted onto skulls. They towered so high that wearing one indoors could graze ceilings, disturb drapery, or create breezes that people politely pretended not to feel. Wigs were powdered, curled, sculpted, decorated, and occasionally stuffed with padding, wire, or fabric to maintain their magnificent height. But the real danger wasn't the height, it was the weight. Some wigs were so heavy that spending an entire evening upright required neck muscles strong enough to qualify for athletic sponsorships. Guests often left parties rubbing their shoulders, not because they had danced too hard, but because their hairpiece had nearly decapitated them. And wigs weren't stable. One enthusiastic gesture or one overly bold bow could send them listing dramatically like a sinking ship. It didn't help that wigs absorbed candlelight like flammable sponges. Many guests socialized under the quiet fear that a stray spark might turn their hair into an emergency. Men were not spared from the fashion battlefield. Sure, their wigs were usually smaller, but their outfits weren't exactly practical. Male Georgian party attire involved coats so elaborately embroidered they sparkled from across the room, waistcoats so tightly fitted they threatened ribcage unity, and breeches that highlighted their legs with theatrical commitment. And stockings, yes, stockings. Georgian men showed more calf at parties than modern fitness influencers. A well-formed leg was a matter of public pride, and men angled themselves in conversations to ensure the most flattering display. Shoes added another layer of difficulty. Heels weren't exclusively female during this era. Men wore heels proudly, small decorative ones designed to elevate stature and emphasize posture. Unfortunately, these heels also made navigating party floors, staircases, and dance steps a thrilling game of will I remain upright? The answer often was no. Falling on one's face while wearing a finely embroidered coat and heeled shoes was an accepted part of the evening. Embarrassing, yes, but expected. And then there were accessories, deceptively small items with unexpectedly large consequences. Fans for women weren't simply for cooling, they were tools of coded communication, flirting and subtle warfare. A fan snapped shut too abruptly could signal disdain. A fan opened elegantly could suggest interest. Dropping a fan could express embarrassment or an invitation. But managing a fan, a wig, a skirt the size of a dinner table, and polite conversation all at once required the hand-eye coordination of someone juggling flaming torches. Men carried snuff boxes, handkerchiefs, canes, and sometimes decorative swords they hoped no one expected them to use. Women carried delicate handbags containing items they might need to survive an evening inside a mobile fortress of fashion. And both sexes prayed that nothing on their person malfunctioned. A ripped seam, a falling wig ornament, or a collapsing hoop could become the scandal of the night. All this spectacle meant that getting ready for a Georgian party could take hours. Entire battalions of servants assisted in dressing their employers. Sewing, lacing, padding, powdering, it was a team effort, and everyone involved knew that the outfit wasn't just clothing, it was social armour. Walking into a room looking anything less than spectacular was a reputational risk that no one wanted to take. By the time guests finally stepped out in their full attire, they weren't merely dressed, they were transformed into living sculptures, ready to stun, impress, and narrowly avoid personal injury. Georgian clothing demanded commitment, endurance, and a healthy willingness to pretend everything was comfortable when nothing was. If you thought Georgian clothing was dangerous, wait until you meet the cosmetics. Getting dressed in this era was only half the battle. The war truly began once the face paints came out. Georgian makeup wasn't simply decoration. It was a full-scale chemical experiment applied directly to the skin, often with the enthusiasm of someone who had no idea their beauty routine could shorten their lifespan. The results were undeniably striking. The ingredients? Undeniably toxic, and the attitude completely unapologetic. Beauty, in the Georgian mind, was worth the risk of slowly turning your face into an alchemical disaster zone. The first rule of Georgian beauty was simple: white face or bust. A pale complexion wasn't just fashionable, it was a social announcement. White skin meant you were wealthy enough to avoid sunlight, labour, and anything involving physical effort. Achieving this flawless, ghostly pallor required thick layers of white face paint known as carouse, an innocent-sounding word that in practice meant a delectable blend of vinegar and lead. That's right, people willingly smeared lead on their faces, daily, repeatedly, passionately. The good news was that it provided excellent coverage. The bad news was that it also provided excellent poisoning, This lead-based foundation was applied generously, often so thick that a guest could walk into a party and leave chalky fingerprints everywhere they sat. At certain angles, people gleamed with the faint reflective sheen of a porcelain doll. Up close, the effect was less elegant. The makeup cracked when smiling, flaked when talking, and clung to clothing like a clingy ghost refusing to move on. It didn't help that lead also slowly corroded the skin underneath, creating sores, discoloration, and damage that required even more makeup to hide. A vicious cycle powered by vanity, chemistry, and complete denial. But ceruse was only the beginning. To add a contrasting flush to cheeks, Georgians used rouge, not today's gentle pigments, but vivid red mixtures containing everything from carmine to cinnabar. Cinnabar, for anyone keeping track, is mercury sulfide mercury on the face. Applied cheerfully, the colour payoff was dramatic, bright, bold cheeks that could be seen across a room. The side effects included tremors, irritability, and the slow creeping suspicion that your beauty routine might actually be fighting you. Rouge was often smeared in circular patterns without blending, giving many wearers a pleasantly startled expression at all times. Compliments flowed regardless. A face could resemble a painted teapot and still be considered gorgeous, as long as it was pale enough and sufficiently unnatural. Subtlety was neither expected nor desired. To be Georgian was to show the world that your face had been curated, sculpted, and chemically enhanced. Then came the finishing touch: beauty patches. These small stylish shapes, hearts, stars, half-moons, dots, were cut from silk or velvet and glued onto the face using adhesive that rarely revealed its list of ingredients. And honestly, it was better not to ask. These patches served multiple functions. They covered blemishes, they added dramatic flair, and most importantly, they communicated coded messages. A patch on the right cheek meant one thing, a patch near the lip meant another. A patch on the forehead hinted at a personality trait, and a patch near the corner of the eye suggested flirtation. Entire romances were launched based on the placement of a tiny black sticker. But beauty patches weren't subtle decorations. They were bold black punctuation marks interrupting the sentence of your face. Against the ghostly white foundation, they looked like dramatic declarations. I am glamorous. I am desirable. Or, I spent 3 hours preparing this look and nearly fainted twice. Speaking of fainting, at least 3 guests at every Georgian party inhaled someone's cosmetic powder cloud and promptly swooned. It wasn't a party until someone hit the floor. Beyond paint and to patches, Georgians embraced eyebrow enhancement with enthusiastic bravery. Thin, expressive brows were in vogue, so much so that some people shaved their natural eyebrows entirely and glued on false ones made of mouse fur. Yes, mouse fur. Imagine socializing in a warm ballroom and wondering if the guest beside you was melting slightly, or if their eyebrows were going to make a run for it. Eyebrow glue was not always reliable. Lip colour varied throughout the century, but a soft tinted look was preferred, often achieved through plant-based stains or homemade concoctions that were only occasionally less poisonous than everything else. Teeth, unfortunately, were difficult to beautify, and many people simply clamped their mouths shut in portraits while hoping candlelight softened reality. Scent was another battlefield. Perfumes were made from blends of flowers, citrus, spices, and whatever fragrant materials someone ambitious could distill. But hygiene was inconsistent, and so were the results. A crowded room filled with sweating bodies, heavy wigs, thick makeup, and ambitious perfume application created an atmosphere that could best be described as romantically chaotic with strong notes of desperation. Despite the hazards, everyone powered through. Wearing Georgian makeup meant enduring itching, sweating, cracking, and occasionally the sensation of being slowly embalmed while still alive. Removing the makeup at night took effort, patience, and solvents that would terrify modern dermatologists. But none of it mattered. In a world obsessed with appearances, the goal was simple. Look ethereal, look dramatic, and above all look like someone who never endured a single hour of labour in their entire life. By the time guests arrived at a party, their faces were not merely painted, They were curated masterpieces held together by hope and hazardous materials. The makeup announced status, beauty, and wealth long before anyone spoke a single word. Before guests swanned into glittering ballrooms with powdered faces and dangerously ambitious wigs, there was the unavoidable ritual of the pre-party dinner, a meal that looked elegant on the surface but was, beneath its polished veneer, a battlefield of social strategy, overcooked meats, and barely contained panic. Georgian pre-party dinners weren't meant for relaxation or nourishment. They were dress rehearsals for social competition, opportunities to judge and be judged, and chaotic feasts where manners quietly crawled into a corner and begged for mercy. These dinners typically began early in the evening, not because Georgians believed in balanced schedules, but because the act of eating required strategy. No one wanted to appear greedy, unrefined, or worst of all, hungry. Appetite was considered a suspiciously lower-class trait, so everyone approached the table with an air of polite restraint while privately praying the food wouldn't kill them. The era's dedication to elaborate cooking did not always translate into cooking well. The table groaned under the weight of massive portions, towering roasts, whole fish staring philosophically into the void, pies filled with ingredients that had lived heroic but questionably fresh lives, and custards that quivered ominously if anyone walked too quickly. Dinner was display, not delicacy. Hosts wanted guests to gasp at abundance, at variety, at the sheer spectacle of meats arranged like soldiers awaiting review. Whether anyone enjoyed eating it was secondary. Whether anyone survived eating it was occasionally a coin toss. Food safety, unsurprisingly, was not the era's strong point. Refrigeration was a dream no one had invented yet, and kitchen storage tended to be more hopeful than hygienic. Meat aged in ways no one discussed. Fish sometimes travelled too far too slowly. Cream had moods, and sauces masked sins. If your spoon stood upright in the gravy without support, you simply pretended it was supposed to do that. Etiquette demanded silence in the face of culinary chaos. But if the food was questionable, the social politics were immaculate. Sharp, complex, and emotionally charged. Where you sat determined your status. Who you spoke to determined your alliances. Who you pretended not to notice determined your grudges. Hosts agonized over seating arrangements with the intensity of military generals planning troop movement. Putting two rivals together at the table, that was not an accident. That was entertainment. Pairing an ambitious young debutante beside an eligible bachelor, also not an accident. That was matchmaking disguised as hospitality. Guests were acutely aware that they were being observed from every angle. The way they held their forks, the neatness of their bites, the enthusiasm, or lack thereof, with which they complimented the food, all were scrutinized. Eating too quickly made you look greedy. Eating too slowly made you seem nervous or indecisive. Choosing the wrong dish could suggest you were uncultured. Choosing nothing at all could imply disdain for the host. Georgian guests had to navigate an entire psychological obstacle course armed with nothing but cutlery and a rapidly dissolving sense of self-confidence. And then there was the drinking. Pre-party dinners provided generous servings of wine, punch, and fortified beverages strong enough to blur the edges of reality. Drinking was expected, encouraged, and somewhat necessary, especially if guests hoped to face the rest of the evening without collapsing under the weight of their wigs, their corsets, or their crippling awareness of social expectations. But overindulging at dinner was dangerous. One glass too many and a guest might begin speaking a little too freely, laughing a little too loudly, or forgetting that soup spoons were not conversational props. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, servants lived a different dinner entirely. The calm, polished dining table was only possible because an entire army of footmen, maids, and kitchen staff operated in a state of choreographed frenzy. The kitchen was hot, crowded, and loud enough to qualify as a minor natural disaster. Servants scurried back and forth carrying trays they hoped wouldn't collapse under the weight of responsibilities, literal and figurative. A dropped plate was not simply a mistake, it was a catastrophe echoing through the house. and if the cook discovered that a dish had gone cold, curdled, or mysteriously deflated, the emotional fallout could rival a Greek tragedy. Guests experienced a serene world of candlelit charm. Servants experienced an atmosphere in which someone was always shouting, something was always boiling, and someone was always one breath away from quitting forever. The contrast between the glittering dining room and the chaos behind it was one of the great theatrical illusions of Georgian hospitality. Yet for all the tension and questionable chicken, the pre-party dinner carried an undeniable thrill. Every glance, every remark, every polite pause was charged with possibility. A compliment could earn you favour. A poorly timed cough could doom you to gossip. A spilled glass of wine could become an anecdote repeated gleefully for weeks. Georgian diners were performers acting out scripts filled with subtext no one acknowledged, but everyone understood. And when the meal finally concluded, after the toasts, the polite laughter, and the silent prayers that no dish would resurface unexpectedly later, guests stood up, adjusted their outfits, gathered their wits, and prepared for the real event. The pre-party dinner had only been the warm-up, the social appetizer before the main course of spectacle and chaos awaiting them in the next room. Stepping into a Georgian carriage to attend a party was not simply transportation, it was a gamble with fate. No matter how glamorous the event promised to be, the journey there was a survival challenge featuring unpredictable horses, treacherous roads, and traffic jams so dramatic they deserved their own orchestral overtures. Before guests even reached the front door of a prestigious townhouse, they had already lived through a miniature disaster film with wheels, hooves, and at least one angry coachman shouting creative insults into the night. Carriages were the status symbols of the age. To own one signalled wealth, power, and the ability to move around town without stepping into mud that threatened to swallow your shoes whole. But status didn't guarantee safety. Carriages came in all shapes and sizes, elegant town coaches, flashy chariots, heavy family contraptions, and delicate little phaetons that looked adorable until a strong breeze threatened to send them airborne. Each design had its own flaws, and each presented new opportunities for chaos. A particularly fashionable carriage might turn heads, and then immediately turn over if the wheel hit a rut. The roads themselves were hazards. London streets, even in fashionable districts, were uneven, narrow, and carved with the scars of carts, animals, and daily traffic. Rain turned them into mud pits. Dry weather turned them into dust storms. Ice turned them into full-blown slapstick routines for horses desperately trying to maintain dignity. Even the most refined guest could find themselves bouncing around their carriage like a decorative figurine on a wobbling shelf, and the smell, an unforgettable combination of manure, smoke, and whatever food scraps had recently been thrown into the street, guaranteed that guests arrived needing a moment to recover from the olfactory assault. The real entertainment, however, came from the traffic. When multiple parties happened in the same fashionable district, all of society clogged the roads at the same time, resulting in carriage pile-ups that turned entire streets into snarling, neighing parking lots. Horses stamped impatiently, coachmen yelled, wheels locked. A single overturned carriage could create a chain reaction of delays so spectacular that people waiting behind it aged emotionally by several decades before moving again. Those who had the misfortune of arriving at the peak of the jam sat in their carriages sweating nervously, hoping their wig powder didn't melt or their hoops didn't bend into abstract shapes. Some hosts hired footmen to stand outside directing traffic, but these brave soldiers had limited authority and even less control over the stubborn attitudes of wealthy carriage owners. A footman might wave urgently at a driver to move forward, only for the driver to shout back that the horse refused on principle. Horses in the Georgian era were not subtle creatures. Many of them loathed the noise, the crowds, and the deeply unnecessary chaos of high society events. When sufficiently annoyed, a horse might rear dramatically, bolt sideways, or simply refuse to move at all, which usually resulted in 10 additional carriages piling up behind it, while everyone inside debated whether this was divine punishment for their vanity. Even when the traffic flowed, the arrival was rarely graceful. Carriages had to pull up in front of narrow entrances, where footmen helped passengers descend without tripping over their clothing or falling face first into a decorative hedge. But hedges were often the true victims of the evening. People fell into them, horses backed into them, carriages rolled over them, and occasionally an unfortunate guest emerged from the shrubbery covered in leaves, attempting to pretend this was all part of their entrance strategy. One memorable arrival could make or ruin a season, and everyone knew it. The darkness didn't help. Without streetlights, roads were illuminated by flickering lanterns that cast long, ominous shadows. A guest stepping down from their carriage might misjudge the height of the step and achieve a dramatic, unintended descent. Coachmen tried to hold lanterns steady, but wind, weather, and personal irritation often made the light wobble at exactly the wrong moment. Many a Georgian guest began their evening by trying and failing to maintain dignity while briefly airborne. And then there was the weather. Rain turned cloaks into soggy burdens and wigs into collapsing soufflés. Wind blew hats off heads and down the street with gleeful disrespect. Snow made driveways slick enough that carriages slid sideways like confused ice skaters. A well-dressed party-goer could leave home looking immaculate and arrive at their destination resembling a battered snowman in expensive silk. Inside the carriage, matters were not much better. Guests were crammed into small spaces stuffed with fabric, hair, perfume, and nerves. Tall wigs required passengers to tilt their heads uncomfortably, while men struggled to keep their coats from wrinkling and their stockings from snagging. Conversation was nearly impossible over the noise of hooves, wheels, and the constant fear that the next bump might send someone's entire outfit into disarray. By the time the carriage finally creaked to a stop in front of the host's home, the passengers had bonded through shared trauma. The arrival itself was a critical social performance. Guests emerged from the carriage trying to appear serene, elegant, and fully in control, despite having just spent 20 minutes rattling around like dice in a cup. They straightened their clothes, touched up their hair, adjusted their posture, and pretended they had not just clung to the carriage walls praying for survival. Footmen opened doors with dramatic flourish, doing their best to help passengers maintain dignity. Some succeeded, many did not, but despite the chaos, these arrivals were part of the thrill. Before a single dance step was taken, before a single flirtation began, before the first candlelit room dazzled anyone's senses, guests had already endured an ordeal worthy of applause. If you made it to the front door in one piece, you were already part of the evening's survival story. Arriving at a Georgian party was not simply a matter of walking through the door. Oh no. That would have been too easy, too modern, too lacking in theatrical flair. In the Georgian era, entering a room was a full-scale performance, the social equivalent of stepping onto a stage where everyone was already seated, already judging, and already whispering. The entrance was your moment, whether you wanted it or not, to announce your existence with confidence, elegance, or, in many unfortunate cases, magnificent disaster. The entrance hall of a Georgian home was designed specifically for spectacle. Candlelight shimmered, mirrors amplified every movement, and polished floors waited eagerly for the sound of approaching heels. Guests paused at the threshold, inhaled deeply, adjusted their wigs, garments, and dignity, and then stepped forward into curated brightness. For those brief seconds, they became living works of art, or clumsy mortals trying not to trip over their own clothing. There was rarely anything in between. Making an entrance required strategy. The goal was simple: be seen. The execution, however, involved choreography. Women entered with graceful curtsies, created through years of practice, muscle memory, and sheer terror of wobbling at the wrong moment. These curtsies weren't small gestures, they were sweeping arcs designed to display balance, poise, and the structural integrity of the enormous skirts surrounding them. A perfect curtsy suggested refinement. A wobbly one suggested that a hoop or corset had staged a violent protest under the surface. Men faced their own entrance rituals. Bowing was essential, and the bow had to be just right, deep enough to show respect, but not so deep that one's wig tipped forward or one's coat collar brushed the floor. A man's bow was a handshake made physical, a coded gesture that communicated confidence, humility, or sometimes the unspoken plea, "Dear God, let me stand upright again." Some men bowed too enthusiastically and nearly toppled. Others bowed so minimally they seemed afraid to commit. But all of them bowed, because in Georgian society, one entered a room like one was greeting royalty, even if the room was full of people who spent most of their day avoiding responsibility. Fans were another essential tool in the grand entrance arsenal, especially for women. After all, a fan wasn't merely a fan, it was a portable stage prop. Women flicked them open with practiced ease, creating soft bursts of air and dramatic rustles. The fan could signal coy interest, polite detachment, or even mild hostility, depending on how swiftly it snapped shut. Some women used fans like puppeteers, letting the flutter of lace disguise the fact that they were scanning the room with laser focus, identifying who to greet, who to avoid, and who had made the dreadful mistake of wearing a rival's colour. The entrance wasn't merely a gesture, it was a message. A guest entering too quickly risked seeming over-eager. A guest entering too slowly risked seeming arrogant. Walking confidently meant you belonged. Hesitating meant you might be lost or socially timid. The timing had to be impeccable, the pace deliberate but not theatrical, though admittedly many guests failed at not theatrical. In the Georgian era, drama wasn't just acceptable, it was practically encouraged. Some entrances were planned like military manoeuvres. Debutantes spent weeks preparing for their first appearance, coached relentlessly in how to glide without appearing to walk, how to smile without revealing nerves, and how to avoid making eye contact with people who might gossip or swoon. Young men rehearsed their posture, practiced not fidgeting with their gloves, and prayed silently that their stockings stayed up and their coat buttons remained loyal. Households took this seriously. A brilliant entrance could elevate one's social ranking, while a disastrous one could become party legend for all the wrong reasons. And then there were the guests who sought out attention on purpose. Some people entered parties with the explicit goal of making a scene. They paused dramatically at the top of the staircase, as though preparing for applause. They adjusted their clothing with theatrical slowness, ensuring everyone had time to notice new embroidery, new jewels, or new scandals. If someone had recently experienced a minor misfortune, an argument, a broken engagement, a lost wager, they might lean into the entrance as if starring in their own tragic opera. Georgian society adored spectacle, and few opportunities offered more potential for spectacle than a deliberately dramatic arrival. Of course, entrances went wrong just as often as they went right. Shoes slipped, skirts snagged, wigs tilted or, in extreme cases, detached entirely. Guests occasionally misjudged the height of a step and descended faster than dignity preferred. One poorly placed foot could send an entire gown swooshing in the wrong direction, revealing more than intended and becoming the talk of the evening. And because mirrors were everywhere, these mishaps rarely went unnoticed. If one failed gracefully, it was almost charming. If one failed badly, the incident travelled through the gossip network at alarming speed. Even when things went smoothly, guests felt the weight of being watched. Every pair of eyes evaluated their expressions, their posture, their choice of attire, and their general air of confidence. The entrance was less about walking and more about declaring, "Observe me, admire me. Pretend you didn't watch me nearly fall 2 steps ago." The moment a guest blended into the crowd, they exhaled. The ordeal was over, the performance complete, the real social games ready to begin. The grand entrance set the tone for the evening. A brilliant one earned nods, whispers, and approving glances. A disastrous one became a story retold with increasing embellishment. But no matter what, the entrance mattered. It authenticated your presence and established your role in the unfolding drama of the night. If the grand entrance set the stage, the music provided the heartbeat of every Georgian party, loud, persistent, and occasionally so chaotic that guests wondered whether the musicians were performing or plotting revenge against the audience. Music wasn't background ambience in the Georgian era. It was the spine of the evening, the emotional thermostat, the force that dictated how people moved, mingled, flirted, or fled. And because there was no such thing as recorded sound, every note, squeak, flourish, and accidental honk came from live humans with instruments and questionable stamina. The musicians themselves were an eclectic mix. Some were professionals hired through respectable networks. Others were enthusiastic amateurs who had convinced their hosts they were quite accomplished on the violin, usually through a combination of desperation charm and very forgiving audition standards. If a Georgian host found themselves short on entertainment, they simply asked, "Does anyone here play an instrument?" Someone always said yes, whether they should have or not. "Congratulations, you've just met the early version of the DJ." The Georgian musical landscape was dominated by string instruments, violins, violas, cellos, all scraping away with an intensity that bordered on athletic. Violins were the stars, nimble, dramatic, capable of soaring melodies or deeply questionable squeaks whenever the bow slipped. A single violinist could elevate an evening into elegance or plunge it into the emotional territory of a haunted attic. Cellists added depth, though the physical challenge of playing in a crowded ballroom often required them to position themselves awkwardly between potted plants and decorative columns, trying not to hit anyone with their bows. Then there were wind instruments, which brought both power and unpredictability. Flutes trilled delicately, offering charm and sparkle. Oboes contributed their unmistakable nasal tone, and bassoons added an earthy honk that remained impossible to ignore. When played well, wind instruments enriched the atmosphere. When played poorly, they startled guests with noises reminiscent of distressed farm animals. No one admitted this out loud, of course. Georgian politeness demanded smiling through auditory discomfort. Harpsichords, those gorgeous tinkling machines, often sat proudly in drawing rooms, waiting for someone with skill, or arrogance, to take a seat and begin playing. Their sharp metallic notes carried beautifully through a townhouse, punctuating conversations and adding a sense of refined drama. But harpsichords were temperamental. Their tuning was delicate. Their volume was inconsistent, and their players sometimes grew overconfident, slamming keys so aggressively that the instrument sounded as if it were taking personal offence at the evening. Larger events might boast full ensembles, their combined sound filling the ballroom with glorious energy. Smaller parties often made do with a couple of determined musicians perched on a balcony or tucked into a corner, playing until their arms ached. It wasn't uncommon for musicians to switch roles throughout the night. One might play violin during the dancing, then shift to flute for the supper music, then collapse behind a curtain for the remainder of the evening while their colleagues soldiered on. Hosts knew well that music controlled the mood. Upbeat melodies encouraged lively chatter. Slower pieces pushed guests toward quieter conversation and romantic manoeuvring. Spirited dance tunes triggered a sudden reshuffling of the crowd as people searched for partners or fled toward the refreshment table. A good host selected the music with care. A great host knew when to adjust it. A terrible host simply allowed the musicians free rein, resulting in unpredictable shifts from graceful minuet to thunderous reel without warning. Volume was another complex issue. Georgian musicians had no microphones, no amplifiers, and no concept of moderation. The sound levels depended entirely on enthusiasm and number of performers. At some gatherings, the music was so soft guests leaned forward desperately trying to catch the melody. At others, the music crashed through the room like an avalanche, drowning out conversation and forcing guests to shout polite greetings at one another, as though participating in a friendly argument. A powerful violinist, fully invested in their craft, could fill the entire house with sharp, vibrating energy that startled newcomers and thrilled those who enjoyed living dangerously. But despite its occasional aggression, Georgian music created an unmistakable magic. Candlelight shimmered across polished instruments. Guests moved in gentle waves as melodies rose and fell. A well-played piece cast a spell, transforming even the most socially anxious guest into someone capable of nodding appreciatively as though they understood musical theory. Music also acted as social glue. Guests gathered near the musicians to listen, or at least to pretend to listen. Lovers used the cover of soft passages to whisper. Rivals judged one another's reactions, elders praised or critiqued the selection. Young men leaned casually against walls trying to appear cultured. And everyone, without fail, commented afterward on the music's quality, sometimes honestly, sometimes diplomatically, sometimes with the relieved declaration that their ears had survived. The musicians themselves were the unsung heroes of the evening. They played relentlessly, adapting to the shifting moods of the crowd, adjusting tempo, navigating cramped spaces, avoiding collisions with dancers, and responding to hosts' frantic gestures to liven it up or soften it down. They endured sweat, heat, poor ventilation, and the occasional guest who wandered too close and knocked over a music stand. But they persevered, because the evening depended on them, and Georgian society revered the ability to create atmosphere through sound. By the time midnight approached, the music softened, transitioning from lively dances to gentler tunes that allowed guests to catch their breath. The evening's emotional arc rested in the musicians' hands, and they guided it with skill, or at least with determination. If the music provided the heartbeat of a Georgian party, dancing was the high-intensity workout disguised as elegance. In a society that adored spectacle, physical coordination, and the opportunity to judge others while pretending not to, dancing was the centerpiece of the night. It wasn't a side activity. It wasn't optional. It was mandatory participation in a fast-paced, emotionally charged, occasionally hazardous ritual. Think of it as the social Olympics, only everyone was wearing restrictive clothing, everyone was sweating discreetly, and everyone was one misstep away from dueling their partner. The moment the dancing began, the ballroom transformed. Guests who moments earlier stood around sipping drinks now surged toward the dance floor with the same desperation seen in modern sales events. Partners were chosen with strategic swiftness. Hesitate too long and you risked being paired with someone who lacked rhythm, balance, or the ability to distinguish left from right. A poor dance partner could ruin an evening faster than a spilled drink or a collapsing hairstyle. English country dances were among the most popular forms, and despite the gentle-sounding name, they were not gentle. These dances involved long lines of couples facing each other, weaving in and out with synchronized steps, hand crossings, and directional changes that required razor-sharp attention. A single mistake could send the entire line into disarray, transforming what should have been elegant patterns into a tangle of limbs and panic. The trick was to smile confidently while secretly praying you remembered which way to turn next. Then there were reels, fast, energetic, and filled with enough spins and hops to leave even the most athletic dancer breathless. Reels demanded enthusiasm, coordination, and an acceptance of chaos. Partners clasped hands, circled each other, and occasionally executed moves that bordered on cardio training. Feet moved quickly, skirts swirled dangerously, and the air filled with the sound of laughter, exertion, and the occasional cry of someone who had accidentally been elbowed. If a guest emerged from a reel without sweating, it meant they hadn't tried hard enough or had miraculously achieved transcendence. Cotillions offered a more structured experience. Square formations, coordinated group patterns, and steps that repeated in predictable sequences. But predictable did not equal easy. One absent-minded dancer could ripple chaos through the entire formation, leaving everyone tripping politely over each other, while trying to pretend the mistake never happened. Guests knew the truth. Cotillions tested social harmony as much as they tested footwork. But beneath all the elegance and structure, dancing was fundamentally a social sport. A contactless yet emotionally charged competition of charm, confidence, and physical endurance. Partners exchanged hands, touched fingertips, and coordinated movements with intimate precision. Dancing close enough to feel someone's breath without appearing improper required mastery of personal space. Misjudge by an inch, and you risk scandal. Misjudge by a foot, and you risk stepping on someone's toes hard enough to ignite a feud. The phrase, "if you step on my foot again, we're dueling," was not simply a joke. It was a perfectly reasonable reaction in the Georgian world. Honor was fragile, pride was enormous, and toes were often sacrificed in the name of social grace. Men tried to maintain composure even as their stockings absorbed the full force of a partner's miscalculated heel. Women, whose shoes were not designed for sturdiness, often endured minor collisions with admirable stoicism while mentally reciting etiquette rules about not screaming in public. Dancing was also the perfect arena for flirtation. A well-timed glance, a soft smile, a slight squeeze of the hand during a turn. These were the romantic sparks that fueled party gossip. Couples danced together not once but several times, each dance deepening the implication that something was brewing. Onlookers pretended to be focused on the choreography while absolutely monitoring every moment. Dancing could launch courtships or end them abruptly. If a young man failed to request a second dance, it signalled lack of interest. If he requested too many, it signalled a potential engagement. Dancing, in short, carried consequences far beyond the dance floor. The physical challenge of dancing was heightened by the fashion of the era. Massive skirts required strategic manoeuvring. Tight coats restricted arm movement. Wigs threatened to list, sway, or simply defect entirely if the dancing became too enthusiastic. Guests felt the burn long before they admitted it. Sweat gathered beneath layers of fabric hidden, thankfully, by dim lighting and relentless politeness. A guest might glide across the floor with apparent serenity while internally gasping like someone climbing a mountain in formal wear. Despite the exertion, the danger, and the unspoken rivalries, Georgian dancers loved the experience. Dancing was freedom encased in etiquette, a chance to move, laugh, and participate in something larger than oneself. It energized the room, it united strangers. It revealed personalities, the bold, the shy, the graceful, the hopelessly uncoordinated. And when the music finally paused, dancers stepped back, flushed, exhilarated, and entirely convinced they had participated in something socially significant. The dance floor offered every guest a moment, brief or extended, to shine. Some embraced it with confidence, others embraced it with fear, but everyone embraced it. Dancing wasn't just expected, it was the price of admission, the test of social capability, and the highlight of the night. If Georgian dancing pushed the limits of physical stamina, the food pushed the limits of digestive courage. The party buffet was a battlefield of shimmering jellies, sprawling roasts, pies with questionable fillings, and fish that looked like they had witnessed ancient civilizations before ending up on a serving platter. The good news was that Georgian hosts prided themselves on abundance. The bad news was that abundance did not guarantee edibility, or safety, or that your clothing, already dangerously tight, wouldn't betray you at the exact wrong moment. Stepping up to a Georgian buffet was like entering a museum exhibit curated by someone with enthusiasm but no restraint. Long tables sagged under the weight of dishes both impressive and alarming. There were jellies moulded into shapes that defied architecture, pyramids, castles, animals, and occasionally designs so elaborate they looked like food had taken up sculpture as a hobby. These wobbly masterpieces shimmered with pride, wobbling in slow motion as if aware of their own precarious existence. Jellies were considered the height of elegance, though no one could explain why. They tasted strange, their texture was suspicious, and if you stared at one too long, it stared back. Beside the jellies sat the meat pies, the backbone of Georgian party dining and also the wild card. Meat pies came in towering, grandiose forms, sealed with thick crusts and filled with mysteries, venison, pork, beef, rabbit, or any combination of living creature that happened to be available. The phrase "don't ask questions" applied heavily here. A meat pie could be delicious and rich, or it could be a culinary trapdoor hiding meat that had spent too long contemplating its own mortality, but etiquette demanded polite enthusiasm. So guests nodded approvingly while quietly hoping today's pie would not be their undoing. Roasted meats dominated the display as well. Whole birds, whole pigs, entire limbs of animals arranged in their full, intimidating glory. Presentation mattered. A roast peacock might appear with its feathers artfully arranged, its body glistening beneath a glaze that sparkled in the candlelight. the grandeur distracted from the fact that the meat itself might have been cooked hours ago, left to cool, then brought back to life with a suspiciously thick sauce. Sauces in Georgian Britain were not so much flavours as they were cover-ups. Fish, however, was the true gamble. Seafood had to travel, sometimes far, sometimes slowly, sometimes with too many stops along the way, before reaching a party table. A fish placed on the buffet often wore an expression that suggested it had been through emotional turmoil. Guests approached seafood with cautious optimism, followed immediately by regret. Smells were politely ignored, eyes were politely avoided, and if anyone asked, "Is this fresh?" the correct response was to blink slowly and change the subject. Despite all these risks, guests eagerly loaded their plates. It wasn't simply about eating, it was about performing social appreciation. To decline food was rude. To criticize food was treason. To visibly suffer after eating food was simply an expected part of the evening. And so plates filled with combinations no doctor would ever recommend. Rich meats paired with dense puddings, gelatinous desserts placed next to aggressively seasoned vegetables, and pastries containing ingredients that no one could identify. The greatest hazard, however, wasn't the food itself. It was attempting to consume food while wearing Georgian clothing. Guests were wrapped, laced, padded, cinched and structured. Sitting at the table already required negotiation with physics. Eating while bound in layers of fabric that restricted attention was a feat of bravery. Every bite carried the risk of discomfort. Every swallow threatened revolt. Emotions range from dainty confidence to quiet internal screaming, as corsets reminded their wearers that overeating was a bold, dangerous choice. Women in particular had to master the art of eating tiny, elegant amounts without looking hungry or miserable. Men, meanwhile, often ate with gusto before remembering too late that their waistcoats did not stretch. Many a Georgian gentleman leaned back from the table with a strained smile that whispered, "I have made a mistake." The combination of tight clothing, heavy food and excessive portions created a perfect storm. Guests walked or waddled toward the ballroom afterward, feeling as though they'd swallowed several bricks wrapped in gravy. And then there were desserts. Custards, trifles, creams, biscuits, and sugary delights piled high. Sweet dishes were a favourite among guests, though they shared an unfortunate tendency to slide, melt, or collapse without warning. A guest carrying a plate of Georgian desserts was essentially carrying a time-sensitive sculpture prone to mood swings. One wrong tilt and a custard could abandon its dish entirely, heading toward a lap, a tablecloth, or an unsuspecting footman with alarming speed. The chaos was heightened by the serving style. Buffets encouraged movement. Movement encouraged accidents. A guest balancing a plate in one hand, a drink in the other, and a wobbling jelly on top of everything was destined for trouble. Slip-ups happened regularly. Splatters were silently acknowledged. Servants rushed to clean spills with the urgency of battlefield medics. Everyone pretended nothing had happened. Despite all this, food remained one of the great joys of Georgian parties. People loved to eat. They loved to admire elaborate dishes. They loved to complain afterward, privately, while clutching their stomachs. The food was imperfect, unpredictable, and occasionally hazardous, but it was also part of the thrill. Surviving the buffet was its own small victory. If the food tested your bravery, the drinks tested your survival instincts. No aspect of a Georgian party carried more pride, danger, chaos, and comedic possibility than the alcohol. This was not a world of polite sips, quietly nursed glasses, or gentle beverages that respected human limits. This was an age where punch bowls were the size of livestock troughs. Wine was strong enough to stun a bull, and gin was consumed for one's health with a straight face. Getting drunk wasn't just common, it was practically a competitive sport. And the average Georgian party had enough alcohol to drown a small town, which, based on contemporary records, was probably very close to happening once or twice. To understand Georgian drinking, picture a society where water was untrustworthy, milk was undignified, and tea was respectable but insufficient for evening chaos. Alcohol filled the void. It filled glasses, it filled stomachs, and on many nights it filled the streets with stumbling aristocrats trying to remember where their carriage was parked. Wine, beer, brandy, rum, whiskey, and gin all flowed with the steady confidence of waterfalls. If a guest claimed they didn't drink, people assumed they were ill, lying, or philosophically unreliable. The undisputed stars of the Georgian drinking universe were the punch bowls, monumental basins that dominated tables, glowed in candlelight, and contained concoctions so potent they could be classified as spells. Punch was the perfect drink of the era, communal, theatrical, and delightfully inconsistent. Every host had a personal recipe, often combining rum, brandy, citrus, sugar, spices, tea, and anything else within reach. The result was a sweet, aromatic mixture that tasted delicious, masked its potency, and hit with the force of an enthusiastic horse. The bowls themselves were iconic. Some were enormous porcelain masterpieces covered in classical imagery. Others were silver, intricately engraved. A few were so large they required multiple servants to carry, and if a guest leaned over the edge too far, their wig risked falling in. Ladling punch became an art form, requiring a steady hand and a willingness to ignore the fact that the punch level dropped faster than anyone could logically explain. Forgiveness was built into the recipe. Wine also reigned supreme. Fortified wines like port and Madeira flowed in endless streams, rich and heavy, and unapologetically strong. These were not delicate wines meant for dainty sipping. They were thunderous, bold, and capable of knocking out a grown man after 3 enthusiastic glasses. Guests drank wine during the pre-party dinner, drank wine during the dancing breaks, drank wine during dessert, and drank wine afterward to celebrate having successfully consumed all the earlier wine. Beer and ale played a quieter role, but were deeply loved by those who wanted to drink constantly without tipping into chaos too early. But quiet is relative. Even beer of the time carried more alcohol than many modern varieties. A night of steady ale drinking produced a slow, warm haze that made everything feel slightly more poetic than it actually was. Then there was gin, the notorious troublemaker of the era. Gin was consumed for medicinal reasons, which was technically true if the illness in question was needing to forget your problems quickly. Georgians justified gin consumption with an impressive array of excuses: digestion, nerves, cold weather, emotional distress, boredom, and the universal favourite, "my doctor insists." Whether or not the doctor actually insisted was beside the point. Gin did its job, and it did it efficiently. Of course, Georgian men took drinking as an opportunity to display competitive zeal. Drinking contests were common. Informal battles of pride fought over tankards, goblets, and punch glasses. Men boasted about their tolerance, exaggerated their achievements, and raised their glasses with heroic determination. The results varied. Some men drank heroically and remained functional. Others drank heroically and ended the night under a table. Still others drank heroically and launched into passionate monologues about philosophy, poetry, politics, or the meaning of life while their friends tried to drag them away from the flower arrangements. Women drank too, often more subtly, sometimes more openly, always with the awareness that society monitored their behaviour far more harshly. But at private parties, especially among close acquaintances, ladies indulged with enthusiasm, sipping wine, nibbling sugar-soaked brandied fruits, and occasionally accepting a punch ladle with the mischievous confidence of someone who knew she wasn't leaving early. The aftermath of drinking was predictably spectacular. Guests stumbled, swayed, sang off key, confessed secrets, laughed too loudly, attempted complicated dance moves, or insisted on giving speeches. Some grew sentimental, others grew philosophical. A select few grew sleepy, drifting off in chairs while their friends gently tried to wake them. And because Georgian clothing involved tight waistcoats and corsets, drunkenness often manifested dramatically, with guests leaning precariously against walls, fanning themselves urgently or whispering, I'm perfectly fine in tones that were decidedly unfine. Servants, meanwhile, watched the unfolding chaos with the weary patience of professionals who had seen everything. They discreetly caught falling glasses, guided swaying bodies towards safer areas, and kept mental lists of which guests were prone to expressing their emotions through song. They earned every penny. Despite the hazards, Georgian drinking culture brought people together. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, loosened conversation, and fueled the evening's energy. It made shy guests bold guests outrageous, and outrageous guests legendary. And in a society where appearances mattered, drinking allowed people to shed their stiff formality, temporarily, enthusiastically, sometimes disastrously, and reveal something closer to their true selves. If dancing was the Georgian party's physical competition and drinking its emotional accelerant, gambling was the arena where money, pride, friendships, and occasionally common sense went to die. Georgian society didn't just enjoy gambling, it devoured it. Cards, dice, wagers on anything that moved or didn't move, and stakes so reckless they made seasoned gamblers sweat. All of it created a nightly symphony of triumph, despair, and the quiet sound of someone realizing they had just lost enough money to purchase a small estate. Gambling wasn't confined to smoky back rooms or dubious taverns. It infiltrated the most elegant drawing rooms, the grandest ballrooms, and the most polite supper parties. If a Georgian host didn't provide some form of gambling, guests assumed they were ill, miserly, or tragically boring. Cards were as essential to an evening as candlelight, and unlike dancing, where a misstep or undue mild embarrassment, a misdeal at the gambling table could ruin your reputation faster than you could say, "I swear that ace wasn't up my sleeve." Card games dominated the scene. Whist, faro, loo, and quadrille all were played with deadly seriousness, and the kind of intense focus usually reserved for military strategy. These weren't games of polite leisure. These were battles between people wearing powder, silk, and expressions of quiet, simmering competitiveness. Players sat in stiff-backed chairs, cards fanned elegantly, gazes sharp as daggers. Even the soft shuffle of a deck seemed to carry dramatic tension. Faro was the favourite among those who believed in luck, which is to say people who had already made several poor decisions that night. The game was fast, flashy, and unforgiving, and its popularity made faro tables magnets for both thrill-seekers and financial disasters. Bets increased quickly, losses increased faster. The banker, the host or appointed dealer, often left the evening with a small fortune while the guests left with nothing but regret and the hope no one noticed the size of their losses. Then came Loo, a game notorious for ruining entire fortunes. Loo didn't play around. A single bad hand could cost a guest the money they had budgeted for the next month, and yet Georgians kept playing with the same cheerful optimism one might expect from someone convinced lightning never strikes twice. Spoiler, it did, often. Dice games added another layer of pure, unfiltered chaos. Hazard was a favourite, and it lived up to its name. Guests tossed dice onto polished wooden tables, watching them bounce and spin with breathless anticipation. Cheers erupted when luck struck. Groans followed moments later when it inevitably betrayed them. People cursed their dice, blessed their dice, kissed their dice, and threatened their dice, all in the same 3 minutes. Dice games had no mercy, and Georgians loved them for it. But gambling extended far beyond cards and dice. Georgians would bet on anything: weather, horse races, the speed of a passing carriage, whether a candle would burn out before someone finished a story, whether Mrs. So-and-so would faint before supper. If 2 servants accidentally bumped into each other in the hall, someone nearby would immediately whisper, "A shilling says the tall one apologises first." Wagers stitched themselves into the fabric of social life, a constant display of ego wrapped in entertainment. The real thrill, however, came from the stakes. Georgian bets weren't small. People gambled away jewellery, snuff boxes, heirlooms, income, inheritances, and occasionally items they absolutely did not own. A wealthy gentleman might sit down with several £100s in his pocket and rise an hour later with nothing but an apologetic smile. Some guests were so spectacularly unlucky that they became legends. Cautionary tales whispered in corners while others continued placing bets with wild abandon. Women gambled just as passionately as men, especially in exclusive ladies' gaming clubs over what was seen by duchesses with nerves of steel. These women played with elegance, poise, and the quiet ruthlessness of people who could ruin you with either a winning hand or a well-timed rumour. Some lost staggering amounts. Some won staggering amounts. All pretended to be calm while hiding emotions that would terrify a modern poker player. And then there were the stories, those delicious, dangerous tales of people arriving wealthy and leaving financially defeated. It was not unheard of for a gentleman to lose so much in one evening that he had to borrow money from his own footman just to tip the servants. Imagine the shame of handing your debt-filled IOU to the person who helped you put on your coat. A few gamblers had to leave early to avoid creditors lurking outside, eagerly awaiting the moment someone stumbled out of the party with empty pockets. Despite the chaos, gambling provided one essential thing: excitement. It gave guests something to brag about and something to gossip over. Wins were celebrated loudly, losses were whispered with dramatic flair. The games bonded people, divided people, reunited people, and occasionally sent people into brief spirals of existential crisis. But they also gave Georgian society its edge, its unpredictable, volatile energy that made every night feel electric. When the cards were finally put away, the dice collected, and the last foolish wager made, guests leaned back in their chairs with pounding hearts, flushed cheeks, and the dizzying realization that they had lived through another round of social warfare. Whether they left richer, poorer, or simply confused, the gambling table had done its work. In a Georgian party, romance wasn't a side activity. It wasn't subtle background ambience. It wasn't even a polite pastime. It was the silent engine roaring beneath every dance step, every conversation, every dramatic entrance, and every accidental brushing of hands. Flirting was the invisible electricity crackling through the air, the reason hearts raced, fans fluttered, and chaperones hovered with the vigilance of military patrols. Where modern romance relies on texting and eye contact across crowded rooms, Georgians relied on coded gestures, dangerous glances, and enough tension to power a city. A Georgian party was essentially one giant social matchmaking arena. Every guest knew it, every host encouraged it, and every married person pretended not to notice it. Courtship rituals played out in real time, sometimes sweetly, sometimes recklessly, and sometimes with spectacular fallout. Romantic drama didn't just accompany the evening, it made the evening. Flirting began the moment guests stepped into the room. One lingering look across the crowd could launch an entire narrative arc. Eyes met and held a fraction too long, signalling everything and nothing at once. A raised eyebrow could mean interest, mischief, confusion, or indigestion. But in Georgian society, ambiguity was part of the thrill. Emotional interpretation became a sport. Women wielded their expressions delicately. Men attempted to smoulder, often with mixed results. Fans were the ultimate romantic weapon. A woman could say nothing at all and still communicate an entire paragraph of intention. A fan opened slowly meant intrigue. A fan snapped shut meant frustration. A fan held near the lips could hint at desire, coyness, or an attempt to hide the fact that she had just eaten something questionable. The rustling of fans signalled a bustling undercurrent of flirtation, like tiny flags in a battlefield of romantic manoeuvring. Hand gestures played a crucial role too. Georgians mastered the art of communicating through touch without ever violating decorum, at least not visibly. During dances, hands brushed, lingered, retreated, or squeezed ever so slightly. A simple hand clasp could send shockwaves through someone's nervous system. A slightly longer than necessary squeeze, That was basically a written declaration of interest delivered through fingertips. And because dancing forced people to interact closely, it was the perfect place for subtle romantic sparks to ignite into gossip-worthy flames. But flirting was not limited to dancing. Conversations were carefully layered with implications. Compliments were rarely straightforward. A remark about someone's wit, posture, ribbon colour, or musical taste could carry hidden meaning. And because everyone knew that everyone else knew, these meanings, interactions were dramatic exercises in delivering subtext while pretending to discuss something innocuous, like weather or wallpaper patterns. The goal was to convey emotion without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Of course, romance in Georgian society was never a private matter. Chaperones, usually mothers, aunts, or older married women, watched every interaction with hawk-like precision. Their goal was to prevent impropriety, which was an impossible task in a room full of powdered faces, flickering candlelight, and young people bursting with desperation and curiosity. Chaperones lurked near potted plants. They whispered warnings, they interrupted conversations at the exact wrong moment. They were the sworn enemies of spontaneous romance, though they pretended otherwise. Men had their own strategies for courtship. Some attempted suave conversation. Others relied on humour, charm, or the timeless approach of standing near their romantic interest and hoping to be noticed through sheer proximity. Wealth, reputation, and good posture helped, but nothing beat confidence. A well-timed bow, a polite question, or a whispered comment during a break in the music could shift the entire emotional landscape of the evening. But romance rarely went smoothly. Scandal lurked in every corner. One misinterpreted glance, one overheard remark, or one too bold gesture could fuel gossip for weeks. Rumours spread quickly, often faster than the truth. A fluttered fan could be mistaken for invitation. A simple smile could be interpreted as a promise. A brief walk toward the balcony, whether intentional or accidental, became suspiciously symbolic. And heaven help any couple caught standing too close behind a curtain or whispering in a shadowy hallway. Guests didn't need facts to start talking. They only needed the faintest whiff of something interesting. Some scandals were accidental. A man might bow too deeply and lose balance, landing awkwardly near a lady in a way that looked far more compromising than it was. A woman might catch her skirt on furniture and need assistance that looked dramatically romantic to onlookers. Even an innocent walk to fetch a drink could be transformed into rumour if someone followed at the wrong moment with the wrong expression. Other scandals were deliberate. Some flirtations were calculated attempts to provoke jealousy, secure attention, or distract from more serious missteps. A flirtatious conversation could be a strategic move in a larger social game. Georgian flirtation operated on many levels: emotional, political, financial, and navigating it required skill, instinct, and occasionally the ability to flee quickly when things spiraled. Yet despite the risks, flirtation was the lifeblood of Georgian gatherings. It created excitement, gossip, intrigue, and stories that circulated long after the candles burned out. Romance made parties feel alive, unpredictable, and charged with possibility. Even guests with no romantic goals found themselves drawn into the atmosphere, enjoying the spectacle of subtle gestures and dramatic misunderstandings. Courtship, at its core, was the elegant dance beneath the evening's chaos, a slow, often chaotic negotiation of affection and reputation. Some couples walked away with promises of future visits, others walked away devastated. A few walked away toward engagements. Many walked away with nothing but confusion and the lingering memory of one very intense hand squeeze. In Georgian society, gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was infrastructure. Forget the postal system, forget newspapers, forget official announcements. The real communication network of the age was woven from whispers, glances, exaggerated retellings, and letters passed along faster than horses could gallop. The moment a Georgian party began, gossip came alive like a mischievous spirit swirling from room to room, slipping into conversations, and gleefully reshaping reputations before the first dance even ended. Gossip had rules, of course, unspoken rules, subtle rules, flexible rules that bent with circumstance, but rules nonetheless. The first rule, speed is everything. A juicy comment lost half its value if someone else heard it first. Guests prided themselves on quick observation and quicker interpretation. Someone entering the room looking flustered, scandal, someone leaving too early, suspicious, someone laughing a little too loudly, definitely hiding something. And once a suspicion existed, it blossomed into a story within minutes. Facts were optional, dramatic flair was essential. Parties were the perfect breeding grounds. Dozens of people packed into echoing halls, everyone dressed to be noticed. Everyone pretending to behave while secretly watching each other with intense curiosity. The environment practically begged for rumour. A whispered comment near the refreshment table could be overheard by a servant, passed to another guest, embellished twice, and presented as shocking revelation before the punch bowl had been refilled. Humans today marvel at viral posts. Georgians would casually destroy a reputation before dessert. Reputation was the currency of the era, and gossip was the market that determined its value. A person's standing could rise or fall based on the kinds of stories circulating about them. The problem was that gossip cared nothing for accuracy. It fed on what sounded true, what felt exciting, or what made for the best storytelling. And Georgian storytelling had a flair for exaggeration. A simple stumble on a staircase became a dramatic fainting episode caused by heartbreak. A polite conversation in a corner became a secret rendezvous. A poorly timed yawn became proof that someone was bored by their own spouse. Women, especially, were both the primary subjects and the most skilled creators of gossip. Their social survival depended on staying informed. They mastered the delicate art of making statements sound innocent while ensuring the implications landed like explosions. A lady might say, "I do hope Mrs. Albright is feeling better. She seemed quite flushed tonight," which, translated, meant, "Spread the news that something is very wrong." Men gossip too, though they preferred to disguise it as sharing information. In reality, they were just as fascinated by rumours, especially if those rumours concerned rival families, rival lovers, or rival drinking champions. Letter writing played a crucial role in extending gossip's reach far beyond the ballroom. The morning after a party, dozens of letters flew across town and country, updating friends and relatives on all the excitement. These letters were filled with vivid descriptions, half-remembered details, and enthusiastic embellishments. A single moment, someone dropping a plate, forgetting their lines during a polite conversation, or choosing an unflattering shade of ribbon, could be immortalized in ink and shared across multiple counties by the end of the week. Recipients would then tell their friends, who would tell their cousins, who would tell anyone within earshot. By the time the original guest heard the rumour, it had outgrown sludge, it barely resembled reality. Caricaturists and satirists added another layer to the gossip machine. Georgian society adored satire, and cruel, bold, exaggerated, and wildly entertaining. Artists produced prints mocking political figures, aristocrats, fashion disasters, and social scandals. These illustrations were sold openly in shops, displayed in windows, and pored over by the public like the hottest celebrity gossip magazines. If someone behaved foolishly at a party, there was always the terrifying possibility that their blunder would become immortalized in a crude drawing, complete with exaggerated features and a scathing caption. Being mocked in a caricature meant you had officially become famous for all the wrong reasons. Rumour influenced everything: marriage prospects, friendships, alliances, invitations, and even business dealings. A person could arrive at a party respected and admired, only to leave as the subject of whispers so powerful that they altered the social landscape overnight. Some people became skilled at managing gossip, spreading carefully curated tales about themselves to maintain an aura of intrigue or sophistication. Others were caught completely off guard, blindsided by the stories they didn't even know existed. Georgian society had little mercy for the unwary. What made gossip so powerful, its ability to reshape narratives instantly. A single whispered comment could turn a harmless incident into proof of scandalous behaviour. A misunderstood remark could brand someone arrogant. A stroke of misfortune could be interpreted as moral failing. And no one wanted to be the last to learn the newest story, because in the Georgian world, being uninformed was almost as shameful as being the subject of gossip itself. Yet for all its dangers, people loved gossip. It added spice to daily life. It created shared experiences. It allowed Georgians to feel connected in a society obsessed with appearances. Gossip made parties thrilling, unpredictable, and unforgettable. The risk of being talked about was part of the fun, and the reason some guests behaved just a little too boldly or dramatically. After all, if people would gossip anyway, why not give them something memorable? By the end of the night, the gossip network had done its work. Stories had been born, twisted, magnified, and sent out into the world. Some would fade by morning, others would grow. But all of them would shape the next week of conversations, letters, and social manoeuvring. Behind every Georgian party glittering with wealth, elegance, music, and social theatrics stood a quiet army of people who worked harder than anyone in the room and received the least credit for it. Servants were the invisible gears that made the night run, or at least appear to run, smoothly. They lit the candles, polished the floors, arranged the food, carried the drinks, caught falling wigs, steadied staggering guests, and prevented more disasters than the entire London Fire Brigade combined. And they did all of this while trying not to be noticed, because Georgian society insisted that servants exist in a paradox, essential yet unseen. Hours before the first carriage rumbled into the driveway, the servants were already deep in preparation. The kitchen staff worked in a humid frenzy, surrounded by pots bubbling aggressively, ovens radiating unbearable heat, and the constant fear that a key dish might collapse or curdle moments before being carried out. Cooks barked orders. Scullery maids scrubbed pans so furiously that the copper seemed to squeak in protest. Footmen dashed in and out carrying trays piled with delicate pastries or dangerously heavy roasts. It was culinary warfare wrapped in aprons and perspiration. Upstairs, housemaids scurried from room to room, ensuring everything sparkled. Polishing became an art form. Tables gleamed. Stair railings shone like gold. Mirrors were wiped until they reflected guests back at themselves with startling clarity. Servants dusted candlesticks, replaced wax, straightened chairs, rearranged flowers, and silently cursed guests who would inevitably undo all their work in a matter of hours. And if a cushion was slightly crooked or a rug had the audacity to wrinkle, a maid fixed it with the swiftness of someone who knew perfection was not optional. Footmen were the movers, lifters, carriers, and general crisis managers. Their night began with greeting guests at the door, bowing, taking cloaks, and praying none of the fabrics weighed more than they appeared. Georgian cloaks were thick, heavy, and often damp from weather, transforming the footmen's arms into temporary coat racks straining under the weight of half the county's outerwear. Footmen memorised names, faces, titles, preferred seating positions, and personal sensitivities because mixing up a guest's identity could spark gossip that lasted for months. Once the party was underway, servants became silent conductors directing the chaos. They glided across the room with trays balanced to perfection, navigating unpredictable crowds and avoiding guests who gestured wildly while telling stories. They refilled glasses, collected empty plates, wiped spills before anyone noticed, and intercepted collapsing jellies mid-descent with reflexes that would impress professional athletes. They extinguished candles that threatened to set wigs ablaze. They intervened when curtains swayed too close to open flames. They repositioned chairs knocked askew by enthusiastic dancers. They prevented disasters, one unobtrusive movement at a time. Servants also had to deal with drunk guests, which was a Herculean task requiring patience, balance, and the ability to maintain a polite expression while supporting someone slowly losing control of their limbs. Helping an intoxicated gentleman find his footing without letting him fall required teamwork. Guiding an intoxicated lady discreetly toward a quieter area required diplomacy. Preventing guests from singing loudly off-key or making declarations they would regret required strategic timing. And when the punch bowl ran suspiciously low, servants prepared more with the resigned knowledge that it would only lead to further complications. The most challenging moments came from unexpected incidents, which were plentiful. Dishes slipped, glasses shattered, pets smuggled into the party escaped, a decorative statue toppled after someone backed into it, a wig caught in a draught sailed dramatically across the room like a strange powdered bird. Servants were always the first to respond, sweeping in with efficiency that made disasters disappear almost instantly. Guests often had no idea how many catastrophes had been narrowly avoided because a servant had quietly handled them before anyone looked up. Servants also endured the emotional atmosphere of the night. They overheard flirtations that grew too bold, arguments whispered behind curtains, and declarations whispered near stairwells. They witnessed rivals exchanging icy smiles and lovers exchanging dangerous glances. They carried letters discreetly, delivered messages silently, and often knew more about the evening's unfolding drama than anyone else. But they spoke none of it. The rule was absolute. Observe everything, reveal nothing. Not every moment ran smoothly. Sometimes things exploded, literally. A candle toppled into a decorative arrangement and burst into flames. A tray slipped and sent a cascade of desserts flying. A sauce boiled over and produced smoke thick enough to alarm half the guests. Servant tripped on a rug someone had moved an inch out of place. When these incidents happened, every servant felt the shockwave. They snapped into action with quiet panic and astonishing coordination. It was a dance, one with far higher stakes than anything happening in the ballroom. And yes, there were always servants who nearly quit by the end of the night. The one who carried 40 pounds of cloaks in a single hour. The one who caught a falling guest while balancing a tray. The one who was scolded for a stain they didn't cause. The one who sprinted up and down stairs so often they could barely breathe. The exhausting combination of physical labour, emotional tension, and unrealistic expectations wore them down. But they stayed because employment was survival, and because they were the unsung masters of making chaos look refined. By the time the final guest drifted out the door, servants were left to face the aftermath. Mountains of dishes, spills to scrub, furniture to move back into place, candles to extinguish, and messes nobody wanted to claim. As the sun rose or the wax burned low, they restored order to rooms that had spent the evening in glorious disorder. After hours of dancing, drinking, gossiping, and pretending not to notice how many wigs were sliding out of place, Georgian partygoers often turned to a new source of entertainment: party games. And these were not gentle, sophisticated parlour amusements. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and frequently towing the line between harmless fun and outright danger. Imagine a room full of adults, already slightly or very much intoxicated, deciding it was the perfect moment to play games normally reserved for children. The result was a spectacle of laughter, shouting, questionable decisions, and the occasional need for first aid. Blind man's bluff was one of the evening's favourite absurdities. A guest, usually someone too polite or too slow to refuse, was blindfolded and spun around until their sense of direction detached from reality. Then, arms outstretched, they stumbled through the room attempting to catch other players, who darted away with the nimbleness of tipsy cats. The blindfolded guest tripped over the furniture, bumped into walls, collided with dancers passing by, and occasionally tackled innocent bystanders. The crowd roared with delight as the room devolved into a comedic chase scene. The biggest challenge wasn't avoiding the seeker, it was avoiding the furniture that servants had very carefully arranged 2 hours earlier. Forfeits were another popular diversion, though the rules shifted with each host's creativity. Guests performed silly tasks or answered playful challenges, often designed to embarrass the participant just enough to entertain the room without causing a duel. Tasks included reciting poems dramatically, singing songs loudly off-key, or mimicking another guest in a way that tiptoed dangerously close to insult. Sometimes players were asked to reveal secrets, and while polite society tried to keep these harmless, There were always one or two guests who interpreted secret as whisper something that will become gossip by morning. The line between entertainment and scandal was a thin one, and forfeits wobbled on it like a guest wearing unstable heels. Charades, yes, the same charades still played today, thrived in Georgian parties long before anyone invented television nights or family holidays. But Georgian charades involved dramatic flair dialed to theatrical extremes. Participants performed scenes with wild gestures, over-the-top expressions, and soundless acting that looked suspiciously like people trying to communicate during a windstorm. Teams shouted guesses, while actors pantomimed wildly, often collapsing in laughter or frustration. What started as an innocent guessing game sometimes escalated into performances so enthusiastic that wigs flew, sleeves tore, and at least one person each evening accidentally knocked over a candlestick. Practical jokes were the most unpredictable element of the game roster. With so much alcohol and energy in circulation, mischievous ideas spread quickly. These pranks range from silly to borderline hazardous. A guest might sneak up behind another and shout unexpectedly. Someone might hide behind a curtain and leap out at precisely the wrong moment. Occasionally, a prankster swapped a powdered wig with a deliberately ridiculous one, leading to a grand reveal that had the room howling, except for the victim, who spent the rest of the evening pretending not to be furious. Some jokes involved placing objects in surprising places, like positioning a decorative bust on a chair so the next person sat on something both noble and uncomfortable. Games sometimes turned competitive, which was when things became truly chaotic. People who moments earlier had been whispering politely now lunged for victory with the determination of prize fighters. Whether the prize was bragging rights, a token gift, or simply the avoidance of embarrassment, players gave their all. Even mild games, such as word challenges or light puzzles, grew intense as guests refused to lose in front of rivals. Georgian pie was a fragile thing, prone to igniting at the slightest provocation. In some houses, more physical games appeared, races, balancing challenges, or improvised duels with rolled-up paper. These were usually played late in the night, when judgment had wandered off and sobriety was a distant memory. Imagine ladies in enormous gowns attempting to dash across a room without stepping on their skirts, or gentlemen leaping over footstools and chairs as if auditioning for some kind of aristocratic obstacle course. The laughter was infectious, the spectacle unforgettable, and the number of near accidents impressive enough that servants hovered nearby like silent guardians. The magic of these games lay in the temporary escape they offered. For a brief window of time, status mattered less. Rivalries softened, formality loosened. Powerful men squealed when startled. Elegant women crawled under tables searching for hiding spots. Dignified guests bent into strange shapes, miming everything from animals to emotions. Laughter filled the room with a kind of warmth that no chandelier could replicate. Even those who normally avoided attention sometimes found themselves swept into the frenzy, their restraint melting away in the glow of candlelight and collective silliness. Of course, not every game ended smoothly. A practical joke could offend the wrong person. A mischievous tug might rip fabric worth a month's wages. Someone might fall, trip, or slide in a way that generated both comedy and concern. But the beauty of Georgian parties was that even mishaps became stories. Stories retold dramatically the next day, embellished the next week, and immortalised months later in gossip that bore only faint resemblance to the original event. Games were the heartbeat of the late evening, the moment when the genteel facade cracked just enough to reveal the playful humanity underneath all that silk and powder. They turned stately houses into joyful playgrounds, and reminded everyone that beneath titles, fortunes, and heavy wigs, they were still people capable of foolishness and fun. If the ordinary Georgian party was a whirlwind of flirting, drinking, dancing, and social manoeuvring, the masked ball was that same whirlwind stripped of brakes, guardrails, and common sense. The moment masks entered the picture, all bets were off. Anonymity, or the illusion of it, since half the masks concealed no more identity than a slightly lowered lampshade, transformed the evening into a playground of mischief, misinterpretation, and deliciously questionable decision-making. Masked balls weren't just events. They were loopholes in the social system, the Georgian equivalent of whispering "no consequences, right?" while doing something you absolutely shouldn't. The magic of a masked ball began the moment guests entered the room. Candlelight bounced off sequined masks, feathered headpieces, and silk ribbons tied just tightly enough to remind everyone that looking mysterious was uncomfortable work. Music swelled with theatrical flair. Shadows stretched beautifully along the walls. People drifted through the space like glamorous ghosts, each one confident that they were unrecognizable, even if their hairstyle, posture, and very distinctive laugh betrayed them instantly. Masks came in endless varieties. Elegant Venetian-style pieces adorned with gold leaf, half masks glittering with jewels, dramatic black dominoes that hid just enough to be intriguing, or elaborate creations shaped like animals, mythological creatures, or abstract designs that suggested the wearer had made bold artistic choices without consulting anyone sensible. Some masks were delicate and alluring. Others were oversized, ridiculous, and prone to sliding down at the worst possible moment. But all masks shared one essential quality. They freed the wearer from the burden of behaving as themselves. Even the most polite guests transformed the instant their faces were partially concealed. Reserved women became daring, flirtatious shadows drifting between partners. Stoic men developed a sudden, unstoppable urge to whisper mysterious phrases that sounded better in theory than in execution. Anonymity gave courage to the timid and recklessness to the bold. Guests felt invisible, despite being dressed in outfits brighter than daylight and perfumes detectable from 2 rooms away. But logic took the night off. It was the mask's time to shine. Mischief flourished everywhere. Someone might tap a stranger on the shoulder, then vanish into the crowd with theatrical flair. People whispered compliments, taunts, jokes, or riddles, and then melted into the sea of masks before anyone could identify them. A masked woman could pretend to be someone else for the evening. A masked man could approach a rival and, with a disguised voice, deliver a comment he'd never dare say openly. Practical jokes multiplied, boldness skyrocketed, and the servants quietly braced themselves. Romance also exploded under the dim, glittering anonymity. A masked glance carried more electricity than any unmasked flirtation. Couples danced closer than usual, drawn together by curiosity and mystery. A lingering touch held double meaning. A soft laugh behind a mask became irresistible. The freedom to pretend created emotional confusion on a grand scale. People fell in love, or thought they did, at astonishing speed. Some spent the night pursuing a particular masked figure, convinced they'd found a soulmate. Others spent the night desperately trying to avoid someone who was definitely not their soulmate but had become far too bold for comfort. And of course, mistaken identity ruled the night. A man might whisper a secret confession to a woman he believed was his romantic interest, only to discover he had just poured out his heart to her cousin, her mother, or, in one particularly famous case, an unamused dowager duchess. A woman might flirt passionately with a masked figure who seemed charming, only to realise later she'd been flirting with her own brother, her best friend's husband, or a guest she had sworn to ignore forever. The comedy of errors was relentless. Some mix-ups were delightful, others required weeks of careful denial afterward. Masks also unleashed the era's appetite for drama. People invented alter egos for the evening. One might adopt the persona of a daring foreign noble, a mischievous spirit, a tragic character from an opera, or someone far more mysterious than their real identity allowed. They deepened their voices, changed the way they walked, imitated accents, and behaved in ways they would never attempt without a mask's protection. Flexing one's theatrical muscles became a vital part of the masquerade experience. But the mask did more than protect identities. It blurred social boundaries. Rank, wealth, age, reputation became temporarily irrelevant. A servant could swap wits with an aristocrat. A shy debutante could charm a powerful gentleman without fear of being judged for boldness. People interacted freely, unpredictably, as if class structure had briefly loosened its grip. It was liberating, thrilling, and slightly terrifying. Not that everything went smoothly. Masks were uncomfortable, strings dug into skin, feathers tickled noses, heat built up under layers of fabric, sweat loosened glue. Some masks slid crookedly, turning elegant faces into comical distortions. A few masks disintegrated entirely when confronted with perspiration, punch spills, or enthusiastic dancing. More than one guest spent the night performing dramatic gestures with one hand, while the other hand desperately held their mask in place. By the end of the night, masks littered the floor, removed in surrender by guests overheated from dancing or exhausted by the effort of maintaining illusions. Once faces emerged, embarrassment followed. Suddenly, everyone realized who they had whispered to, flirted with, avoided, insulted, or confessed undying admiration to. The aftermath of a mask ball was an emotional audit, thrilling for some, horrifying for others. But that was the beauty of the mask ball. It offered a temporary escape from expectations, from identity, from the rigid rules that defined the Georgian world. For a few hours, guests could be anyone they wanted, try anything they dared, and blame everything later on the anonymity of the mask. For all the noise, music, dancing, and flamboyant displays happening in the main rooms of a Georgian party, the real heart of the evening often pulsed behind closed doors. The grand ballrooms, drawing rooms, and candlelit corridors were dazzling, yes, but the private rooms, the tucked-away spaces, the half-lit stairwells, and the curtained alcoves were where the true drama unfolded. Affairs, confrontations, whispered alliances, financial negotiations, and emotional detonations all simmered away just out of public view. If the ballroom was the stage, the private rooms were the backstage chaos where the actors dropped their polite smiles and revealed their motives. The geography of a Georgian house lent itself perfectly to secret dealings. Townhouses were full of nooks, side chambers, back staircases, and sitting rooms tucked behind larger spaces. Servants moved through these areas constantly, but guests discovered that if you timed your steps carefully, slipping away as the dancing reached its most distracting crescendo, or the punch bowl drew a crowd, you could disappear into a quiet corner without anyone noticing. Or at least that was the hope. Georgian houses were full of eyes, and privacy was often an illusion wrapped in wishful thinking. Affairs flourished in these hidden spaces, whispered into existence between breaths of candlelight. Romantic tensions that simmered on the dance floor often boiled over the moment two people found themselves alone, or thought they were alone. A stolen kiss, a tightly clasped hand, a murmur of forbidden affection. These things happened quickly, recklessly, and with the awareness that a single witness could turn private passion into public catastrophe. Doors that clicked shut a little too firmly drew suspicion. Curtains that rustled drew curiosity. And a pair of shoes seen peeking beneath a chaise longue could launch an entire county's worth of rumour. Arguments erupted behind closed doors as well. The Georgian world thrived on polite facades, but grievances needed outlets, and private rooms were ideal battlegrounds. Friends confronted each other over perceived slights. Siblings bickered over inheritances, romances, or embarrassing behaviour. Spouses took refuge in secluded hallways to debate decisions made earlier in the evening. The polite murmur of the party masked the hiss of whispered disputes. Occasionally, a raised voice slipped through a doorway, followed by an awkward silence and the sound of someone storming off, attempting to look dignified while absolutely failing. Political scheming found fertile soil in these private spaces. Members of parliament, influential landowners, and ambitious rising figures seized the opportunity to escape the crowded rooms and talk strategy in quieter corners. A gentleman pretending to admire a painting in an empty study might actually be negotiating votes. A pair of ladies strolling into a side chamber might be planning a coalition of social influence. Even a seemingly harmless conversation between two guests leaning against a window frame could represent a shift in power dynamics. Politics fed on subtlety, and the private rooms of Georgian parties provided deliciously fertile ground. Business deals happened here too, discreet, tense, and often conducted with the solemnity of conspiracies. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and investors attended parties not just for fun, but to secure their futures. A man might pull another aside to discuss debts. Someone else might offer an investment opportunity in hushed tones. A third might quietly attempt to renegotiate a failing deal before news of it spread. Party walls absorbed secrets worth thousands of pounds, while nearby guests danced blissfully unaware of the financial drama unfolding behind them. Not all hidden activities were so deliberate. Some guests wandered into private rooms by accident, or so they claimed. Perhaps someone looking for a restroom stumbled into a study containing two people standing far too close. Maybe someone searching for a place to fix their hair ended up discovering a heated argument. Sometimes guests simply needed a quiet place to breathe after too many dances, too many drinks, or too many emotional revelations. These accidental intrusions created awkward encounters that could be spun into gossip or strategically ignored depending on the visitor's discretion. Servants, moving silently through these areas, witnessed everything and carefully pretended not to. They saw flirtations begin, alliances shift, tempers flare, and secrets unfold in dimly lit corners. They carried trays past closed doors and heard snippets of arguments they were expected to forget instantly. They guided lost guests away from rooms that held things best left unseen. Their discretion held the entire fragile ecosystem together. Sometimes private room drama spilled out into the main event. A man might return from a secret meeting with a shattered expression. A lady might re-enter the ballroom with flushed cheeks and trembling hands, immediately attracting attention she didn't want. Two rivals might emerge from a heated conversation, their politeness stretched thin as silk over iron. Observers noticed everything, even when they pretended not to. The emotional echoes of private conversations reverberated through the party like distant thunder. And then there were the true scandals, the ones that blew the doors off their hinges. A couple caught in an embrace, a heated financial disagreement that turned into a physical shove, a clandestine meeting interrupted by someone who was absolutely not supposed to see it. These moments, when exposed, ignited the gossip machine with explosive force. They were retold instantly, embroidered enthusiastically, and immortalized before the candles had burned halfway down. Private rooms were the shadowy counterpart to the sparkling public spaces. They held all the messiness, humanity, risk, and truth that polite society carefully concealed beneath powdered faces and practiced smiles. They were the lungs of the party, inhaling tension and exhaling drama. For all their splendor, some Georgian parties had a dangerous habit of turning into full-blown catastrophes. Beneath the glitter and grace lived a lurking truth. Nothing about these events was safe. Not the architecture, not the lighting, not the clothing, not the animals, yes, animals, and certainly not the people attending. Georgian hosts aimed for elegance, but the universe, perhaps exhausted by so much silk and powdered ambition, often responded with chaos. When calamity struck, it did so with dramatic flair, ensuring that no guest ever forgot the night something or someone went gloriously wrong. Fire was the most common enemy. Georgian lighting relied entirely on candles, thousands of them. Chandeliers groaned under the weight of flaming tapers. Wall sconces flickered dangerously close to draperies. Delicate decorations were placed lovingly next to open flames as though daring fate to intervene. With guests moving, swirling, and bumping into everything in sight, flame-related mishaps were inevitable. Sleeves brushed too close to a candle and ignited. Ribbons smouldered. Decorative greenery burst into enthusiastic sparks, and wigs, tall, powdered, flammable wigs, hovered precariously in the danger zone. When a wig caught fire, the room erupted into frantic motion. Someone would shout a warning, someone else would panic and run in circles. A servant who had been standing quietly in the background would spring forward with superhuman reflexes to smother the flames, saving both the wig and the dignity of its wearer. The smell of burnt hair mingled with perfume and candle smoke, and everyone politely pretended nothing unusual had occurred. Georgian decorum required ignoring the obvious. "Ah, yes," they seemed to say. Lady Pembroke's head combusted slightly, but let us continue the cotillion. Structural disasters were the next great hazard. Georgian townhouses were not built to withstand the sheer weight of dozens of dancers, over-eager flirtations and intoxicated guests stomping rhythmically in unison. Floors groaned under pressure, plaster trembled in sympathy, and beams quietly questioned their life choices. There are recorded instances of floors giving way during particularly enthusiastic dance sessions, sending guests tumbling into the room below in a cascade of skirts, shoes, wigs, and shrieks. Imagine the chaos. One moment you're dancing gracefully. The next you've fallen through the ceiling and landed beside the dessert table in the middle of someone's whispered scandal. People emerged from these collapses dust-covered, stunned, and oddly grateful to be alive. The momentary panic dissolved quickly into horrified laughter, shocked conversation, and frantic attempts to regain composure. Afterward, guests retold the story with dramatic embellishment, transforming mild injuries into heroic survival tales. Fainting was another frequent spectacle. After hours spent in tight clothing, heavy wigs, dense perfume, and crowded rooms with minimal ventilation, guests toppled like decorative dominoes. A lady feeling lightheaded would sway delicately before collapsing into the waiting arms of whoever stood nearest, sometimes a suitor, sometimes a servant, sometimes a startled stranger who suddenly found himself clutching a fainted aristocrat like a misplaced parcel. Men fainted too, though they preferred to call it momentary dizziness, a phrase that didn't quite hide the fact that their knees had buckled during a dramatic violin flourish. Once a guest fainted, everyone reacted with exaggerated urgency. Salts were fetched, fans waved furiously, someone shouted instructions no one followed. A cluster formed instantly, obscuring the victim from sight and fueling speculation. Heat exhaustion might be blamed, or bad air, or overexcitement. Never, of course, the tightness of their clothing or the 3 cups of punch consumed moments earlier. Georgian society loved fainting. It created drama without scandal, chaos without blame. Animal-related disasters added another unpredictable layer. Wealthy Georgians kept exotic pets, and some, eager for attention or disastrously confident, brought them to parties as conversation pieces. Monkeys, parrots, small dogs, even the occasional ill-advised reptile appeared at these events. These animals never behaved. A monkey might leap onto the buffet table, sending jellies wobbling and guests screaming. A parrot might shriek insults it had learned from the household staff. A spoiled lapdog might tear through the ballroom, dragging someone's lace handkerchief like a battle trophy. On rare but memorable occasions, an exotic creature escaped, turning the house into a frantic chase scene while servants begged silently for retirement. Weather added its own flair to the disaster lottery. Storms could knock out outdoor lanterns, plunging arriving guests into utter darkness. Thunder sent horses rearing, carriages colliding, and guests stumbling into the house drenched, breathless, and looking as though they had arrived straight from an ocean voyage. Sudden gusts of wind burst through open doors, extinguishing candles or sending fragile decorations tumbling onto startled guests. Nature, it seemed, delighted in creating obstacles for Georgian sophistication. Then there were the small disasters, the ones that didn't send the entire room into chaos but nevertheless plagued the evening. Someone spilled punch on a priceless rug, and everyone pretended not to see the stain. A guest leaned too close to a decorative pedestal and sent a porcelain vase crashing down like a tiny emotional tragedy. A heated argument in a side room grew loud enough that the nearest dancers faltered mid-step. Someone tripped over the edge of a carpet, flinging themselves forward with a gasp. Someone else tore their sleeve on a rogue nail. And always, somewhere in the house, a servant whispered, "Not again." Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, Georgian party disasters became part of the culture. Guests expected mishaps the way modern audiences expect plot twists. Disasters gave the night texture, intensity, and stories to share for years. Nobody wanted catastrophe, of course, but if it happened, they certainly wanted to witness it. The magic of a Georgian party was that even with calamity lurking behind every candle, everyone continued, dancing, laughing, flirting, pretending that complete chaos wasn't mere steps away. The disasters became threads in the larger tapestry of the night, reminders that beneath the elegance and shine, these gatherings were gloriously, delightfully human. If flirtation powered the atmosphere and gossip fueled the excitement, politics was the hidden match that could set an entire Georgian party ablaze. In an age of revolutions, philosophical upheaval, national anxieties, and fiery international debates, political conversations were both irresistible and incredibly volatile. They slithered into salons, supper rooms, corners of the ballroom, and anywhere two or more opinionated Georgians gathered. A party could begin in harmony and end with half the guests questioning each other's sanity, morality, or loyalty to the crown. Politics didn't just enter the room amiss. It marched in wearing boots, carrying a torch, and asking loudly, "So, have you heard what Parliament did this week?" Salons were the polite epicentres of intellectual warfare. Hosted by sharp-minded women armed with wit, charm, and an uncanny ability to steer discussions like seasoned captains, salons were designed for lively debate. Guests sat in beautifully curated rooms, sipping tea or wine, and exchanging ideas on philosophy, economics, literature, and government. The goal was intellectual engagement, but the result was often one of two things: the birth of a new movement, or someone storming out with the stiff posture of a person pretending not to be offended. Salon hostesses walked a delicate tightrope, encouraging spirited conversation while preventing their rooms from turning into verbal dueling grounds. Political thinkers thrived in these gatherings. Radicals arrived ready to challenge centuries-old traditions with ideas fresh from the presses, or straight from the coffee houses, where debates boiled hotter than the tea. Conservatives entered with equal passion, determined to defend the social and political structures they believed held the nation together. Add a few drinks, a recent scandal in Parliament, or a controversial pamphlet circulating around town, and sparks flew faster than you could say constitutional monarchy. Discussions rarely stayed polite for long. Someone mentioned taxes, everyone tensed. Someone brought up foreign policy, eyebrows rose. Someone whispered reform, and suddenly the entire room felt like it had been dunked into a philosophical volcano. Voices grew louder. Fans snapped open and shut with increasing agitation. Men gestured with the sweeping enthusiasm of theatre actors. Women delivered razor-sharp commentary disguised as polite observation. Each participant believed passionately in their side, and being wrong, or even partially wrong, was unthinkable. Occasionally the debates were exhilarating. A radical thinker might introduce a revolutionary concept about liberty, equality, education, rights, or the shifting roles of power, and the room would buzz with electricity. People leaned forward. Ideas danced like flickering light. The salon became a cauldron of possibility. These were the conversations that shaped pamphlets, inspired future reformers, and helped push society, slowly and reluctantly, into new eras. But just as often, political discussions slid into chaos. Two men would stand, gesturing pointedly, their faces turning a heroic shade of crimson. Someone's temper would fray. Someone's pride would snap. Someone else, usually a hostess, would desperately try to change the subject, exclaiming loudly about the desserts, or complimenting a painting with the intensity of someone attempting to defuse a bomb. In some cases, arguments ended with icy silence, thin smiles, and the unspoken promise never to speak again. In others, the arguments simmered into days-long feuds, carefully maintained through frosty greetings and passive-aggressive remarks at future gatherings. The problem wasn't just beliefs, it was performance. Georgian society thrived on display, and politics offered the perfect chance for guests to showcase their intelligence, their loyalty, their reading habits, or their ability to quote prominent thinkers with dramatic flair. Debates became competitions for attention, each participant battling for conversational dominance. A man who normally avoided drama might suddenly deliver a passionate monologue about government corruption. A quiet woman might cite ancient philosophy with such precision that she left the room in stunned silence. A proud gentleman who hadn't read the pamphlet under discussion might bluff his way through the argument, nodding vigorously and hoping no one asked for specifics. Alcohol didn't help. Punch had a way of turning mild disagreements into fiery confrontations. A slightly tipsy guest, emboldened by enthusiasm and questionable judgment, might say something they wouldn't dare say sober. A political remark spoken too loudly could offend someone 3 feet away. A bold declaration about war, taxes, or social inequality could ignite an entire corner of the room like a philosophical bonfire. Even the physical arrangement of the house influenced political fiascos. Parlours encouraged intimate debate. Libraries offered quiet corners where 2 people could argue passionately beneath the gaze of disapproving portraits. Balconies were perfect for heated one-on-one exchanges involving dramatic hand gestures visible from the ballroom below. And those unlucky enough to wander into a room mid-debate often found themselves trapped, forced to nod sagely while praying for rescue. But for all the conflict, political discussions gave Georgian parties their intellectual spark. They transformed gatherings into forums of ideas. They allowed people to express their hopes, fears, visions, and frustrations. They connected private households to the broader currents of history. Revolutions abroad, reforms at home, debates about rights, representation, and the future of the world. These conversations were messy, passionate, and occasionally disastrous, but they mattered, and sometimes, quietly, they changed things. A casual debate sparked a lifelong friendship. A disagreement planted the seed of a future invention or advocacy effort. A salon conversation inspired someone to take political action. Beneath the shouting, gesturing, and thinly veiled insults, ideas moved. And movement, however small, was powerful. Still, the risk of social fallout was real. A poorly timed remark could cost someone invitations for months. A heated argument could fracture alliances. A radical statement could brand someone dangerous. But Georgians kept talking anyway because politics, for all its chaos, gave parties depth. It turned gatherings into stages where history whispered between the clinking of glasses. When a Georgian party finally sputtered to an end after the last dance, the last argument, the last secret meeting, and the last punch-fueled disaster, the night did not simply end. It lingered. It clung. It followed every guest home like an overly affectionate stray dog. The real consequences arrived not in the ballroom but the next morning, when reality, daylight, and regret teamed up to deliver a triple punch to the face of every attendee. What awaited them was always the same: throbbing hangovers, explosive gossip, unexpected financial revelations, letters written in panic, and the realization that last night's behavior had consequences that no amount of powdered wig could hide. Morning came with brutal honesty. Georgian houses, still cold in the early hours, echoed with the pitiful groans of partygoers waking up in states ranging from mildly uncomfortable to spiritually defeated. Anyone who had indulged in punch, which was everyone, awoke with a headache that felt like a miniature orchestra performing inside their skull. Wine left its own mark, creating dry mouths, aching limbs, and memories that began coherent and ended in poetic blurs. And those who had participated in late-night drinking competitions suffered worst of all, staring at the ceiling with the dazed expression of a person reconsidering every life choice they'd ever made. Clothing offered fresh humiliation. Many guests woke still dressed from the night before, corsets twisted, cravats crooked, hairpins barely holding together the remains of once elegant hairstyles. Powder streaked faces like ghostly war paint. Shoes lay abandoned in improbable places. Someone inevitably discovered a crushed piece of dessert in their pocket, put there during a moment of chaotic optimism. The morning after mirror was the harshest judge of all, reflecting not the glamorous creature who attended the party, but a confused figure who looked like they'd wrestled a chandelier and lost. But physical suffering was only the first challenge. The gossip networks launched into action at dawn. Letters were written at dizzying speed, delivered with breathless urgency. Servants whispered the moment their employers weren't listening. Neighbours leaned out windows to share updates. Coffee houses buzzed with rumours before the sun fully rose. Everyone wanted to know everything. Who fainted, who fought, who flirted too boldly, who arrived scandalously late or left suspiciously early, whose wig had caught flame, who had made a spectacle during a game, and who had been caught emerging from a private room looking flushed and dishevelled. By mid-morning, entire reputations had been shredded, stitched together, or altered dramatically, all without the subject's knowledge. One misunderstood moment became a story. One exaggerated retelling became a warning. One careless remark became a social weapon. Some guests woke to discover they were the talk of the town, not because they had done anything interesting, but because their name sounded good in a rumour. Others discovered that their actual dramatic moment had been transformed into a myth of operatic proportions. Debts added another layer of morning misery. Those who gambled during the party, which was nearly everyone, had to face the financial aftermath. Some realised they'd lost far more money than they remembered. Others experienced the cold dread of knowing they had won money from someone important and would now need to pretend it hadn't happened. A few guests stared in horror at hastily scribbled IOUs in their pockets, wondering what the elegantly flourished signatures meant. And the truly unfortunate were those who owed money not to other aristocrats but to their own servants, having begged for coins at the end of the night after losing everything at the gaming table. Apologies became a crucial part of the aftermath ritual. Guests wrote letters attempting to repair relationships damaged by overenthusiastic debates, misinterpreted flirtations, drunken declarations, or accidental insults. These letters were works of art, part confession, part excuse, part flattery. "My dear sir, forgive the warmth with which I defended my political position," translated to, "I am sorry I shouted and spilled wine on you." "Dear madam, I fear I spoke too freely," meant, "I accused your cousin of cheating at cards." And "I trust we understand each other better today," meant, "We will pretend this never happened and never speak of it again." Some apologies were more urgent. Guests who had caused disasters, like knocking over decorations, startling someone's pet, or breaking a valuable vase, penned letters filled with mortified gratitude and frantic offers to pay for damages. A few guests had to apologise for intruding into private rooms, for dancing too wildly, or for calling someone by the wrong name all evening. The most dramatic apologies involved romantic misunderstandings, especially those born of masked balls, dim corners, or misread gestures. These letters danced delicately around details, offering vague regrets without admitting guilt in writing, the Georgian version of damage control. Reputation management consumed the entire morning. People strategized how to respond to rumours, who to avoid, who to reassure, and how to frame their version of last night's events before someone else framed it for them. Some hurried to visit hosts to show gratitude and downplay mistakes. Others visited close friends to gather intelligence on what exactly had been said. And a few simply stayed indoors, dramatically ill, hoping absence might soften the blow of whatever story had gone viral. Meanwhile, servants, exhausted from cleaning up mountains of shattered glass, melted wax, food spills, scattered feathers, and abandoned accessories, exchanged their own accounts, the most accurate and the least shared. They knew who had truly fainted, who had nearly fallen down a staircase, who had ignited their sleeve, and who had spilled the punch bowl with spectacular flourish. Their version of the party was the honest one, but naturally, the world preferred the myth. By noon, the emotional hangover had arrived, the dreadful realization that the party was over, but the consequences were not. Guests replayed the night in their minds, trying to remember what they'd said, who they'd spoken to. and whether they had behaved like charming social butterflies or absolute fools. Some swore they would never drink again, a promise they could be trusted to break by next week. Others vowed to attend fewer parties until the next invitation arrived. The aftermath was a ritual of its own, messy and magnificent, the true cost of a night lived too loudly. But Georgians, resilient as their wigs were flammable, recovered. Because for all the agony and embarrassment, there was always another party on the horizon, and another chance to rewrite their story. When all the candles guttered out, when the punch bowls were empty, when wigs were slightly askew and reputations were even more so, one truth remained. Georgian parties weren't just entertainment, they were the beating heart of an entire era. These gatherings shaped politics, culture, fashion, gossip, romance, and even architecture. They were more than events. They were ecosystems, they were emotional laboratories, they were social battlegrounds, and above all, they were the dazzling, chaotic embodiment of Georgian Britain itself. Put simply, Georgian parties didn't just entertain people, they survived them. At their core, these parties existed because Georgian society needed them. Britain in the 18th and the early 19th centuries was a place of rapid change. Cities swelled, empires expanded, class lines blurred, ideas exploded. Wealth, influence, and identity all shifted constantly. In a world where the ground moved beneath people's feet, parties became steady anchors, spaces where individuals could showcase who they were, who they wanted to be, or who they hoped others would mistake them for. The dance floor was a stage. The drawing room was a theatre. Every evening was an act of self-invention. More than any era before or after, Georgians believed deeply in the power of performance. Life wasn't meant to be lived quietly. It was meant to be displayed. That's why entrances were grand, clothing extravagant, manners theatrical, and conversations carefully improvised. Parties sharpened these instincts. They trained people to navigate complex social choreography. They rewarded confidence, wit, charm, or, failing all that, dramatic flair. Even disaster became part of the spectacle. A fainting fit or a toppled wig wasn't just misfortune. It was a memorable moment, a line in a story everyone would retell. Parties also functioned as the Georgian networking machine. Alliances formed between dances. Business deals were negotiated after dessert. Marriages sparked from a single shared glance. Political movements whispered their first breaths in salon corners. Behind every chaotic night lay a deeper purpose. Survival in a world where reputation was currency and connections were everything. The more extravagant the party, the more potent its influence. Attendance alone signalled status. Hosting signalled power. Failing to be invited signalled a social death that no amount of powdered hair could remedy. And then, of course, there was the irresistible appeal of escapism. Georgian life could be harsh, unpredictable, even frightening. Wars raged abroad, disease lingered. Cities choked on smoke, poverty and inequality shadowed the era. Parties offered a shimmering, candle-lit refuge from reality. A temporary kingdom where music drowned out worry, where beauty eclipsed hardship, where laughter numbed fear, and where a person could forget for a few hours that the world outside was anything less than extraordinary. But the true magic of Georgian parties lay not just in their escape, but in their contradictions. The era prized order, yet parties thrived on chaos. Society demanded restraint, yet parties encouraged indulgence. Etiquette praised modesty, yet fashion reached architectural heights. People obsessed over maintaining composure, yet regularly fainted, spilled, argued, misbehaved, and made gloriously terrible decisions. Georgian gatherings lived in this tension between elegance and absurdity, rules and rebellion, calculation and spontaneity. The chaos wasn't just accidental, it was the point. This contradiction, this messy brilliance, is what made Georgian parties so culturally defining. They captured the spirit of a society on the cusp of transformation. Bold, theatrical, curious, ambitious, and occasionally ridiculous. Within their walls, the era's anxieties and triumphs mingled like dancers weaving through a country reel. People tested boundaries, they swapped ideas, they tasted risk, they flirted with danger, they embraced moments they'd later pretend never happened. And through it all, they stitched together a rich tapestry of stories, scandals, and memories that survived long after the last candle melted. These parties also left legacies that shaped British social life for generations. The art of hosting evolved, the structure of gatherings became more formalised, the rituals of dancing, conversation, and presentation influenced Victorian salons, Edwardian dinners, and even modern events. The Georgian obsession with self-display paved the way for later eras' own fashionable excesses. The salon debates contributed to intellectual movements. The masked balls inspired a love of theatricality. The grand suppers birthed traditions of elaborate dining. Even the mistakes, the collapses, the fires, the fainting episodes became warnings that influenced future architecture and safety choices. Above all, Georgian parties left behind a story. The story of an era fueled by energy, imagination, and sheer audacity. They remind us that history is not only shaped by wars and governments, it's shaped by human gatherings, by nights when people danced, flirted, argued, schemed, dreamed, or simply tried not to fall down in front of their peers. The Georgian party was a microcosm of its world, reflecting both its brilliance and its flaws, its discipline and its chaos, its elegance and its excess. And that's why they defined the era. Not because they were perfect, not because they were calm, but because they were alive, messy, unpredictable, unforgettable. They showed the best and worst of the people who lived them. They pushed boundaries and built memories. They spun together politics, pleasure, danger, intellect, vanity, and humour into one glittering whirlwind. Georgian parties didn't just entertain people, they survived them. And in doing so, they carved themselves into history as some of the most vibrant, unhinged, culturally rich social spectacles the world has ever known.